Good evening and welcome to Embers and Pages, where we retell the world's most beautiful stories in a voice meant for rest. How are you tonight? I hope the day treated you kindly. If it asked too much of you, if you feel the weight of too many thoughts, you're safe here now. Here, we journey together to quiet places. We let the world turn without us for a little while. Tonight, we descend beneath the waves with Jules Verne's masterpiece from 1870, a story of the ocean's mysteries, and one man's quiet rebellion against the world above. This is a tale of wonder and captivity, of exploration and isolation, told through the eyes of Professor Aronnax, a naturalist who finds himself aboard the most extraordinary vessel ever conceived. Beneath the surface of the sea, he will witness marvels beyond imagination, guided by the brilliant and tormented Captain Nemo, a man who has chosen the depths over the light. Before we slip beneath the surface, let's prepare. Dim your lights until they're barely glowing, or let darkness settle around you completely. Lower the volume to a whisper, soft enough that you must lean into it, so your mind has nothing to do but listen. Settle yourself. Let your head find the pillow. Feel the weight of the blankets, the coolness of the sheets. Breathe in slowly, hold it, then release. Again, in and out. You have nowhere to be but here. Don't worry if you drift away before the story ends. That's not only acceptable, it's exactly what should happen. This tale will wait for you, patient as the tide. Tonight, your only task is rest. Our story begins in the year 1866, when something strange stirs in the world's oceans. Ships report a massive creature, glowing and swift, that moves beneath the waves with impossible speed. Some call it a monster, some call it a miracle. Professor Aronnax, a man of science and wonder, stands on the deck of a great ship, scanning the darkening horizon, not yet knowing that he is about to leave the surface world behind, perhaps forever. The world in 1866 was smaller than it had ever been. Steam-powered ships crossed oceans in weeks instead of months. Telegraph cables stretched beneath the seas, connecting continents with invisible threads of communication. Humanity had begun to believe it understood the planet, that there were no mysteries left worth fearing. And then the reports began. A ship sailing off the coast of Australia spotted something in the water, something vast and luminous, moving with a speed no whale could match. The captain described a glow beneath the waves, greenish and eerie, and a shape longer than his vessel. When he tried to approach, it vanished into the depths as if it had never been. Days later, a steamer crossing the Pacific nearly collided with what the crew called a floating island. But islands do not move. When they lit their lamps and peered over the rail, they saw not rock or coral, but something smooth and metallic, something that pulsed with light. Then, with a sound like rushing water, it dove, leaving only foam and bewilderment. The stories multiplied. A whaling ship in the North Atlantic, a merchant vessel near the coast of Japan. Each encounter different, but all describing the same impossibility. A creature, or perhaps a machine, of staggering size and intelligence. Some said it was a new species of whale. Others whispered of sea serpents from ancient legends. A few, the more imaginative, suggested it was something built by human hands, though no nation would claim it. Fear spread among sailors. Insurance companies raised their rates. Shipping routes were altered to avoid the most common sighting areas. Governments grew concerned. What if this thing, whatever it was, turned hostile? What if it began attacking ships deliberately instead of merely frightening them? Professor Aronnax followed these accounts with the hunger of a man whose life was dedicated to understanding the natural world. He was a naturalist, a scholar of marine biology, recently returned to Paris after an expedition to the American West. His reputation was solid, his knowledge vast. When he read the descriptions of this creature in the newspapers, his mind filled with possibilities. Could it be a living thing, he wondered, some deep-sea leviathan driven to the surface by unknown forces? Or was it, as some skeptics suggested, mass hysteria, sailors seeing what they expected to see in the play of moonlight on water? He published an article in a French scientific journal, carefully reasoned and full of data. In it, he argued that if the creature existed, it was most likely a species of narwhal grown to unusual size. The response was immediate. Some praised his level-headedness. Others mocked him for being too cautious, for refusing to believe in something truly extraordinary. And then, one spring morning, a letter arrived. It was from the commander of the United States Navy frigate Abraham Lincoln, a fast and powerful vessel being prepared to hunt the creature. They wanted Professor Aronnax to join the expedition as a scientific observer. His expertise, the letter said, would be invaluable. Aronnax read the letter 3 times. His hands, you understand, were trembling. This was an opportunity that came once in a lifetime, if that. To be present at the discovery of a new species, to witness firsthand whatever mystery lay beneath the waves. How could he refuse? He accepted immediately. His servant, Conseil, a man of unshakable loyalty and remarkable calmness, packed their belongings without question. Conseil had been with Aronnax for years, a steady presence who organized specimens, took notes, and never complained, no matter how remote or uncomfortable the expedition. If the professor was going to sea, so was he. They traveled to New York and boarded the Abraham Lincoln. The ship was magnificent, built for speed and strength, its engines the finest American engineering could produce. The crew was experienced, the captain determined. This was not a casual voyage. This was a hunt. Among the crew was a man who would become both companion and complication, Ned Land, a Canadian harpooner of legendary skill. Ned was tall, strong, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of facing down whales in open water. He did not believe the creature was anything supernatural. He believed it was flesh and blood could be killed. The 3 of them, Aronnax the scientist, Conseil the servant, Ned the hunter, stood on deck as the Abraham Lincoln left the harbor. The city grew small behind them. The open ocean spread wide ahead. Somewhere out there, beneath the rolling waves, something waited. The journey began with tedium, the kind that settles into a sailor's bones after days of seeing nothing but endless water. Days passed, then weeks, each one blending into the next. The routine became familiar. Morning watch, afternoon drills, evening meals in the cramped galley where men spoke in low voices about what they might find, or whether they would find anything at all. The crew scanned the horizon constantly, eyes straining against the glare of sun on water, looking for any sign, a flash of light, a disturbance in the waves, anything that might indicate they were not alone out here. But the ocean kept its secrets. It rolled on, indifferent to their searching, vast and empty, and giving nothing away. Some began to doubt. The initial excitement that had filled the ship when they departed New York had faded, replaced by skepticism and weariness. Perhaps the creature had moved to another part of the world, they whispered to each other during their off hours. Perhaps the sightings had been exaggerated, tricks of light and shadow turned into monsters by frightened imaginations. Perhaps, the more cynical suggested, it had never existed at all, just a collective delusion, a shared hysteria that newspapers had amplified into something more substantial than it ever was. Aronnax understood their doubts. He felt them himself sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded him, and he lay in his bunk listening to the creak of timbers and the endless slosh of water against the hull. What if they were wrong? What if he had dragged himself across an ocean, left his comfortable life in Paris, all for nothing more than a legend? But morning would come, and with it renewed hope. He spent his days in the ship's small library, studying everything he could find about marine biology, about legendary sea creatures, about the depths and the strange life that existed there. He made notes, drew sketches, theorized. Conseil kept their cabin tidy, brought meals at regular intervals, and assisted with the research in his quiet, methodical way. He seemed content simply to be useful, asking no questions about their purpose. Ned grew restless as only a man of action can when forced into idleness. He paced the deck for hours each day, his powerful frame coiled with unused energy. He would stand at the rail and stare at the water, as if he could will the creature to appear through sheer force of personality. Other crew members gave him space, sensing the frustration that radiated from him like heat. "It's out there," Ned would say to Aronnax when they shared meals. "I can feel it. The ocean holds it, but it's there." Waiting, Aronnax wanted to share that certaine deso certainty, but his scientific training made him cautious. Feelings were not data. Intuition was not proof. And then, one November evening, as the sun sank low and the air turned cool, a shout rang out from the crow's nest. There, off the starboard bow, aglow beneath the water, faint at first, then brighter. The ship turned toward it, engines roaring. The crew rushed to the rails. Aronnax felt his heart hammering in his chest. The glow moved, fast. Too fast for any living thing of that size. It circled the ship, not fleeing but observing, as if deciding whether they were worth its attention. Ned grabbed his harpoon. The captain shouted orders. Aronnax watched, transfixed, as the creature, or whatever it was, passed directly beneath them. He could see it now vaguely through the dark water, something long and sleek, with a smooth hull, no, not a hull, a body, and that strange, phosphorescent light emanating from it. Ready, Ned called, his arm pulled back. The creature surfaced, just for a moment, a dark, curved shape glistening wet in the fading light. And then, before Ned could throw, before anyone could react, it dove. The water surged, the ship rocked, and the chase truly began. For hours they pursued it through the night. The creature stayed just ahead, always visible, never close enough to strike. It was playing with them, Aronnax realized, testing them, measuring their speed. Then, without warning, it stopped. The ship stopped too, engines idling, everyone holding their breath. The water was calm. The glow had vanished. Ned stood ready, harpoon poised. The captain scanned the darkness with his glass. "Where is it?" someone whispered. And then it came, not from ahead, from behind. A massive impact, a sound like thunder, and the ship lurched violently to one side. Aronnax was thrown against the rail. He heard shouting, felt water spraying over the deck. The creature had rammed them, and with such force that wood splintered, metal groaned. Another impact. The ship tilted. Aronnax scrambled for a handhold, but the deck was slick, and his fingers found nothing. He fell, the cold water swallowed him. He surfaced, gasping, saw the ship listing, saw figures running on deck, heard Conseil calling his name. He tried to swim toward the ship, but the current pulled him away. Something grabbed him. Not the creature, Conseil, brave Conseil, who had jumped in after him. They clung to each other in the dark water, watching helplessly as the Abraham Lincoln drifted farther away, damaged and struggling. Then Ned was there too, having leapt in with a rope that snapped before anyone could pull them back. The three of them floated in the vast, empty ocean, the ship a fading silhouette against the stars. And then, beneath them, the glow returned. Slowly, carefully, it rose. Aronnax felt something solid beneath his feet, not scales, not flesh, metal. They were standing on the creature, and it was no creature at all. The surface beneath their feet was hard and smooth, like polished steel but warmer, as if heat radiated from within. Aronnax pressed his palm against it, half in wonder, half in disbelief. This was no living creature. This was a machine, a vessel of some kind, hidden here in the middle of the ocean where no ship should be. Conseil stood beside him, water streaming from their clothes, shivering but silent. Ned Land, always the most practical of men, was already investigating, crouching down to examine the surface, running his hands along its curve. "It's iron," Ned said, his voice rough from the salt water. "Or steel, riveted. This is a ship. An underwater ship." The words hung in the air for a moment, impossible yet undeniable. Before any of them could respond, a sound echoed from beneath, a mechanical grinding, followed by a hiss of escaping air. Part of the surface shifted. A hatch, circular and seamless, began to open. Light spilled out, warm and yellow, so different from the cold moonlight above. A ladder extended upward. And from below, voices speaking in a language Aronnax couldn't immediately place. "Down," Ned whispered urgently. "Get down before they see us." But it was too late. Figures emerged from the hatch, dark silhouettes backlit by the glow. They moved with precision, coordinated, clearly trained for this exact situation. Strong hands grasped Aronnax, not roughly but firmly. He heard Conseil gasp, heard Ned shout something defiant, but resistance was futile. They were pulled toward the hatch, guided down the ladder into the belly of this impossible vessel. Aronnax's scientific mind tried to catalogue everything. The smooth walls, the electric lights. Yes, electric, not gas or oil. The hum of machinery, the smell of oil and metal and something else, something like ozone. They descended into a corridor, narrow but well lit, lined with valves and gauges and instruments Aronnax had never seen. The men who held them wore simple clothing, dark and practical, and they said nothing, communicating only with gestures and quick glances. Finally, they were brought to a room and left there. The door closed behind them with a heavy, final sound. A lock clicked. The room was small but not uncomfortable. There were benches along the walls, a porthole, looking out into the black water and soft lighting from above. It was dry, warm, and utterly silent, except for the distant hum they had heard before, a sound like the heartbeat of the ship itself. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned stood in the center of the room, dripping seawater onto the metal floor, and looked at each other. "Where are we?" Conseil asked quietly. "Inside it," Aronnax said. "We're inside the creature, the thing we've been hunting." Ned moved to the porthole and peered out. "We're underwater," he said, "deep. I can't see anything but darkness." Aronnax felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. They were prisoners, yes, but prisoners aboard the most extraordinary invention human hands had ever made. An underwater vessel, capable of speeds that defied reason, able to dive and surface at will. How was it powered? How did it navigate? What genius had conceived of such a thing? Hours passed. They had no way to measure time except by their own exhaustion. Eventually, they sat on the benches. Conseil, ever the optimist, suggested that perhaps their captors would explain. Ned, ever the realist, checked the door repeatedly and found it immovable. Aronnax simply stared out the porthole, watching the dark water, wondering how deep they were, how far from the surface. Fear tugged at him, yes, but so did something else. A hunger to understand, to know, to see what lay ahead. Finally, the lock turned. The door opened. Two men entered. One was short, muscular, with an air of authority that suggested he was an officer of some kind. The other was different entirely. He was tall, perhaps 40 years old, with a commanding presence that filled the room before he even spoke. His face was striking, not handsome in a conventional way, but compelling, with dark eyes that seemed to hold both intelligence and sorrow in equal measure. He wore a simple uniform, black with silver trim, no insignia of any nation. He moved with the confidence of someone who had absolute control over his domain. He looked at the three of them, one by one, his gaze lingering on Aronnax with something like recognition. Then he spoke in perfect French. "Good evening, gentlemen. I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting. I am Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. You are aboard my vessel, and you are, I regret to inform you, my prisoners." His voice was calm, even gentle, but there was steel beneath it. This was not a man to be trifled with. Aronnax found his own voice. "Captain Nemo, that name means no one," Nemo interrupted. "It is enough. As for who I am beyond that, you need not concern yourselves." "You attacked our ship," Ned said, stepping forward, fists clenched. "You could have killed us." Nemo's expression did not change. "Your ship attacked me. I defended myself. The fact that you survived is fortunate. The fact that you are here, however, complicates matters." "Then let us go," Ned said. "We'll say nothing about what we've seen." A faint smile touched Nemo's lips, though it held no warmth. "You think I would believe that? You think any man, having seen what you've seen, would remain silent? No, Mr. Land. You will remain aboard the Nautilus, permanently." The word hung in the air like a sentence of death. Aronnax felt his breath catch. "Permanently? You mean to keep us here forever?" Nemo turned to him, and for a moment the hardness in his eyes softened just slightly. "You are Professor Pierre Aronnax, are you not? The author of the Mysteries of the Ocean Depths. I have read your work. You have a mind that appreciates the wonders of the sea. Perhaps in time you will come to see your captivity not as imprisonment, but as opportunity." "Opportunity," Aronnax repeated, stunned. "Yes," Nemo gestured toward the porthole. "Out there lies a world that no human has truly explored. The ocean covers 2/3 of the Earth, and yet humanity knows almost nothing of its depths. I offer you the chance to see what no scientist has seen, to witness marvels that exist in no museum, to understand the sea as few ever will. In exchange, you will remain aboard my ship, and you will speak of it to no one in the world above." It was a devil's bargain. Freedom for knowledge, the surface world for the depths. Aronnax wanted to refuse. He wanted to demand release, to insist on his rights as a French citizen, to appeal to whatever sense of justice this man might possess. But the words caught in his throat, because part of him, a part he was not proud of, was already imagining it. The species he might discover, the geological formations he might observe, the data, the research, the understanding that could be his. "And if we refuse?" Conseil asked quietly. Nemo's gaze shifted to him. Then you will remain in this room until you change your minds or until you die. I gain nothing from your comfort, gentlemen, but neither do I wish you harm. The choice, as much as it can be called a choice, is yours." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You will find clothing in the cabinets along the wall. Dry yourselves, eat if you're hungry, food will be brought shortly. I will return tomorrow and we will discuss the terms of your stay." "Wait," Aronnax called. "Captain, please, how is this possible? This vessel, the technology, the speed, where did it come from?" Nemo looked back at him, and for just a moment something flickered in his expression. Pride, perhaps, or loneliness. "It comes from knowledge, Professor, and from a desire to leave the world of men behind." Then he was gone, the door ceiling shut behind him with that same heavy finality. The three of them stood in silence. Finally, Ned spoke, his voice bitter. "We are trapped. In a metal coffin at the bottom of the sea with a madman." Conseil said nothing, simply went to the cabinets and began searching for dry clothes. And Aronnax turned back to the porthole, staring into the darkness, wondering if Nemo was mad, or if perhaps, in some strange way, he was the sanest man alive. The Nautilus moved beneath them, a gentle thrumming vibration. They were descending, Aronnax realized, deeper, farther from the light. Morning came, though Aronnax could only know it by his pocket watch, salvaged miraculously from his wet clothing. The porthole showed the same unbroken darkness. They were still deep, still moving, the Nautilus cutting through water with a smoothness that seemed almost unnatural. They had changed into the dry clothes provided. Simple trousers and shirts, well-made but without decoration. They had eaten the food that appeared through a small hatch in the wall. Bread, cheese, fish prepared in a way Aronnax didn't recognize, and water that tasted pure and cold. Conseil had slept a few hours on one of the benches. Ned had spent most of the night pacing, testing the door, examining every surface for weaknesses. He found none. The Nautilus was built with precision that bordered on perfection. When Captain Nemo returned, it was with the same quiet authority, the same unreadable expression. He carried no weapons. He didn't need them. His presence alone commanded respect, or perhaps fear. "I trust you rested," he said, though it was not really a question. "As well as prisoners can," Ned replied, his tone sharp. Nemo ignored the barb. "Come, I will show you your new home." He led them out of the small room into the corridor. As they walked, Aronnax's eyes tried to absorb everything. The series of watertight doors, each marked with numbers and symbols. The pipes running along the ceiling, likely carrying air or water or steam. The occasional crewman passing by, each one nodding respectfully to Nemo but saying nothing. They came to a larger room, and Aronnax's breath caught. It was a library. Floor to ceiling, every wall was lined with shelves, and every shelf was packed with books. Thousands of them in dozens of languages. He saw scientific texts, works of philosophy, literature from every era and culture. There were maps, diagrams, journals bound in leather. It was a collection that would rival any university. "You read," Nemo said, watching Aronnax's expression. "I thought you would appreciate this." "It's extraordinary," Aronnax whispered, moving closer to the nearest shelf. He recognized titles, rare volumes he'd only heard of, some he thought had been lost. "How did you?" "I have spent years gathering knowledge," Nemo said. "Books are one of the few things from the surface world I value. You are welcome to read anything here." They moved on, through a dining room with a long table made of polished wood, past what appeared to be sleeping quarters for the crew, and then into a space that made Aronnax stop in his tracks. It was a salon, grand and beautiful, with a high ceiling and walls that were not metal but glass. No, not glass. Thick, transparent panels that looked out into the ocean, and the ocean was alive. Schools of fish swam past, silver and quick. Jellyfish drifted by, glowing faintly in the darkness. Plants swayed with invisible currents, forests of kelp and coral. The light from the Nautilus illuminated everything in a soft, ethereal glow, turning the water into a theater of wonders. Aronnax pressed his hands against the glass, his heart racing. He had dedicated his life to studying the sea, and yet he had only ever seen its surface, its edges. This was the sea itself, the hidden world he had only dreamed of. "How deep are we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 50 meters at the moment," Nemo replied, "but the Nautilus can descend much farther. The deepest I have taken her is 16,000 meters. Impossible, Aronnax breathed. The pressure alone would crush any vessel. Nemo allowed himself the faintest smile. The Nautilus is not like any vessel. Her hull is designed to withstand pressure that would turn iron to powder. Every rivet, every seam, every plate has been calculated and tested. She is as much a part of the ocean as the creatures that swim past us. Conseil had joined Aronnax at the glass, his eyes wide. Professor, look, that fish, is it a species we know? I'm not sure, Aronnax said, squinting. The coloration is unusual, and the fins. There are species down here, Nemo said, that have never been catalogued. Creatures that live their entire lives in darkness, that have evolved in ways surface science cannot yet explain. If you wish, Professor, you may study them. You may take notes, make observations. I have instruments, microscopes, specimen jars. The ocean is your laboratory now. It was a gift and a chain at the same time. Aronnax felt the weight of both. Nemo led them deeper into the ship, down a spiral staircase to the engine room. The sound here was louder, the hum they had heard before now a steady thrum of power. Great machines lined the walls, pistons moving in perfect rhythm, gauges displaying pressure and temperature, wheels turning with mechanical grace. The Nautilus is powered by electricity, Nemo explained, raising his voice slightly over the noise. Generated from sodium extracted from seawater, the process is efficient, clean, and provides more than enough energy for our needs. We can travel at speeds exceeding 50 knots, dive and surface in minutes, and remain submerged for as long as our supplies last. And air? Aronnax asked. How do you breathe down here? We surface periodically to refresh our tanks, Nemo said. But we also have a system that extracts oxygen from the water itself. It is not perfect, but it allows us to remain below for extended periods. Ned was less impressed with the machinery than the others. He was looking at the hull, running his hands along it, frowning. This is a prison, he muttered. A beautiful prison, but still a prison. Nemo heard him but said nothing. They returned to the salon, and Nemo gestured for them to sit. He stood near the glass, his back to them, looking out at the passing sea. I know what you think of me, he said quietly. You think I am a tyrant, perhaps, or a madman who has abandoned civilization for some twisted purpose. You are wrong, but I do not expect you to understand, not yet. Then help us understand, Aronnax said. Who are you, Captain? Why do you live like this? Nemo was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, tinged with something that might have been sorrow. I am a man who has seen the worst that humanity can offer. I have witnessed cruelty, injustice, suffering inflicted by those who should protect the weak. I have lost everything I loved to the greed and violence of nations that call themselves civilized. And so I left. I built the Nautilus with my own hands, with the help of men who shared my vision. We came here to the one place on Earth where the sins of mankind cannot reach. He turned to face them, and his eyes were hard again, the moment of vulnerability gone. The surface world is welcome to its wars, its empires, its endless hunger for power. I want no part of it. The ocean is my country, the Nautilus is my home, and you gentlemen are now citizens of a nation that will never appear on any map. Aronnax wanted to argue, to point out that isolation was not the answer, that humanity was capable of good as well as evil. But the words felt hollow. He had seen enough of the world to know that Nemo's bitterness was not entirely unearned. What do you want from us? Conseil asked. Nothing, Nemo said. Accept your silence, live aboard the Nautilus. Learn from the ocean, but know that you will never leave. And if we try, Ned demanded. Nemo's expression did not change. Then you will fail. The Nautilus is invulnerable. There is no escape from the depths, Mr. Land. The sooner you accept that, the easier your life here will be. He left them then, retreating down the corridor with his measured stride. The three of them sat in the salon, surrounded by the impossible beauty of the underwater world, feeling the weight of their captivity settle over them like a blanket. I won't accept this, Ned said, his jaw tight. I don't care how deep we are, I'll find a way out. Perhaps, Aronnax said quietly, watching a ray glide past the glass, its wings moving in slow, graceful arcs. But perhaps, Ned, we should also pay attention while we're here. We may never have another chance to see what we are seeing. Ned snorted and walked away, but Aronnax remained at the glass, his mind already filling with questions, with wonder, with the irresistible pull of discovery. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was also, in a strange and terrible way, exactly where he had always wanted to be. Days turned into weeks, though time aboard the Nautilus had a strange quality, as if it moved differently beneath the waves. There were no sunrises to mark the morning, no stars to signal night. There was only the rhythm of the ship, the gentle hum of the engines, the endless passage of water beyond the glass. Aronnax fell into a routine. He woke, or rather, he decided it was time to wake, and made his way to the salon. Breakfast was served at a table near the great windows, and it was always extraordinary. Fish prepared in ways that brought out flavors he had never imagined. Seaweed salads seasoned with minerals from the deep, bread baked fresh in the Nautilus's galley. Every ingredient came from the ocean. Nemo refused to take anything from the surface world. After breakfast, Aronnax would spend hours at the glass, observing. He kept a journal, filling page after page with sketches and notes. He documented fish species, their behaviors, the way light refracted through the water at different depths. Conseil assisted him, as he always had, offering observations in his calm, methodical way. Nemo sometimes joined them, standing quietly nearby. He would point out details Aronnax missed, the way a particular fish's scales reflected light to confuse predators, the structure of coral that allowed it to thrive in crushing pressure. Nemo's knowledge was vast, deeper even than Aronnax's own, earned through years of direct observation. There was respect between them, a shared love of the natural world that transcended their circumstances. But there was also an unspoken boundary. Aronnax asked no personal questions. Nemo offered no personal revelations. They spoke of science, of the ocean, of discovery, and nothing more. Ned Land, however, did not adapt so gracefully. He spent his days prowling the ship, testing doors, questioning crewmen who would not answer, measuring distances, calculating possibilities. He was a man of action trapped in a world of waiting, and it gnawed at him. "We can't stay here," he would say to Aronnax and Conseil in the evenings. "This isn't living, this is existing in a cage." "A very beautiful cage," Conseil would reply mildly. "That doesn't make it any less a cage," Ned snapped. Aronnax understood Ned's frustration. He felt it too sometimes late at night when the reality of their situation pressed down. He had family, colleagues, a life on the surface. He missed Paris, the smell of rain on cobblestones, the simple pleasure of walking through a park. But he also could not deny the pull of what he was experiencing. This was science at its purest, unmediated observation of a world no one else could see. One morning, or what passed for morning, Nemo came to them with an invitation. "There is a forest nearby," he said, "an underwater forest. I thought the professor might like to see it up close." Aronnax's heart quickened. "Up close? You mean outside the ship?" "Yes, we have diving suits. They are of my own design, providing air and mobility. It is quite safe if you follow instructions." Ned immediately stepped forward. "I'm coming." Nemo regarded him coolly. "Of course, Mr. Land, though I must warn you, any attempt to escape will be futile. We are still far from any coast, and swimming to the surface from this depth would kill you in minutes." "I understand," Ned said, though his tone suggested he was still calculating. They were taken to a small chamber near the bottom of the Nautilus, where rows of strange suits hung on the walls. The suits were made of heavy rubberized fabric, with helmets of thick glass and metal. Tanks of compressed air were strapped to the back, connected by tubes to the helmet. There were weighted boots to counteract buoyancy and lamps attached to the chest. Nemo's crew helped them dress. The suits were cumbersome, the helmets claustrophobic at first. But once Aronnax adjusted to the sound of his own breathing echoing in the confined space, he felt a thrill of anticipation. They entered an airlock, a small chamber that sealed behind them. Water began to fill the space, cold even through the suit. The pressure equalized. Then the outer door opened, and they stepped out into the ocean. Aronnax's first thought was that he was flying. The weighted boots kept him grounded, but the sensation was still dreamlike. He moved slowly, each step a graceful push against the water. Around him, the underwater forest stretched in every direction. Towering plants with broad, swaying fronds, their stems thick as tree trunks, their leaves filtering the faint light from above. Fish darted between the stalks, unbothered by the strange figures moving through their world. A school of silver fish parted around Aronnax like a curtain, then reformed behind him. An octopus regarded him from a cluster of rocks, its eyes intelligent and curious, before jetting away in a cloud of ink. Nemo moved ahead, his lamp illuminating the path. He gestured for them to follow, leading them deeper into the forest. The plants grew denser, the light dimmer, until they were walking through a twilight world where every sound was muffled and every movement felt significant. Conseil was beside Aronnax, his face visible through the helmet glass, eyes wide with wonder. Even Ned seemed momentarily captivated, his usual restlessness replaced by awe. They came to a clearing of sorts, a space where the plants gave way to smooth sand. Nemo knelt and brushed the sand aside, revealing something beneath, a stone carved with symbols. Aronnax leaned closer. The symbols were weathered, ancient but unmistakable, human-made, a monument of some kind or a marker. Nemo straightened and moved on, leaving the stone buried once more. Aronnax wanted to ask about it, to understand what they had just seen, but speech was impossible in the suits. The question would have to wait. They walked for what felt like an hour, though time was difficult to judge. They saw creatures Aronnax had only read about in the most speculative texts. Luminescent jellyfish the size of carriage wheels, crabs with shells like armor, eels that glowed with their own internal light. Every few steps brought a new marvel. At one point, Nemo stopped and pointed upward. Aronnax looked and saw the hull of a ship, or what remained of one. It was ancient, broken, its timbers rotted and covered in barnacles. Fish swam in and out of the shattered hold. It was both beautiful and sad, a reminder that the ocean claimed everything eventually. When they finally returned to the Nautilus and removed their suits, Aronnax felt exhausted but exhilarated. His notebook could not contain everything he had seen. His mind raced with observations, questions, theories. "Did you see the stone?" he asked Nemo as soon as they were back in the salon. "I did," Nemo said. "What was it?" Nemo looked at him for a long moment. "A gravestone, from a civilization that existed long before our own. The ocean remembers what the land forgets, Professor." He offered no further explanation, and Aronnax knew better than to press. That night, lying in his bunk, Aronnax stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile his feelings. He was a prisoner aboard a vessel commanded by a man who had turned his back on the world. He had no freedom, no choice, no control over his own fate, but he had also walked through an underwater forest. He had seen things no other scientist would ever see. He had touched a piece of history that predated recorded time. Was it worth it? He didn't know. Across the small cabin, Conseil slept peacefully as he always did. In the bunk below, Ned Land lay awake, staring at the same ceiling, thinking not of wonders but of escape. The Nautilus traveled on, cutting through the Pacific Ocean with the purposefulness of a predator. Aronnax consulted the charts in the library when Nemo allowed it, tracing their route. West from the Americas, across thousands of miles of open water, toward the archipelagos and reefs, where the ocean floor became a landscape of mountains and valleys. Nemo spoke little of their destination. He seemed content to move, to explore, to keep the ship in constant motion, as if stopping would mean confronting something he preferred to avoid. The ocean here was different from the Atlantic waters where they had begun. The light, when they rose to shallower depths, was clearer, sharper, the blue so intense it hurt to look at. Marine life was more abundant, more varied. Every day brought new species, new colors, new patterns of behavior. Aronnax filled notebook after notebook. Conseil labeled specimens in jars, careful and precise. Ned sharpened his knives and stared out the windows, his mind always on the surface world, on freedom. One afternoon, Nemo summoned them to the salon with an unusual urgency in his demeanor. "We are approaching a site of significance," he said. "I wish to pay my respects. You may accompany me if you choose." They suited up once more and descended into the water. The ocean floor here was deeper than before, the pressure greater, the light almost non-existent. The lamps on their suits created small pools of illumination in an otherwise absolute darkness. Nemo led them across a barren plain of sand and rock. No plants grew here, few creatures stirred. It was a place of silence and stillness, and yet Aronnax felt a weight to it, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. They came to a rise in the seafloor, a small hill crowned with coral that had grown in strange, deliberate patterns. As they drew closer, Aronnax realized it was not natural. The coral had been cultivated, shaped, arranged to form a sort of garden. In the center of the garden was a cross, simple and stark, made of coral cemented together with some kind of adhesive. Beneath it, the sand had been smoothed flat, as if something lay buried there. Nemo knelt before the cross. He remained there, utterly still, for several long minutes. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned stood at a respectful distance, uncertain what they were witnessing. When Nemo finally rose, his movements were slow, as if he carried a great weight. He placed his hand on the cross for just a moment, then turned and walked back toward the Nautilus without looking at them. They followed in silence. Back aboard the ship, after they had shed the diving suits and returned to the warmth of the interior, Aronnax dared to ask, "Captain, forgive me, but whose grave was that?" Nemo stood with his back to them, looking out through the salon glass at the receding darkness. "A member of my crew," he said quietly. "A friend. He died here doing what he loved, surrounded by the ocean. I buried him in the only place he would have wished to be." "I'm sorry," Aronnax said, and he meant it. Nemo did not respond for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The ocean is my refuge, Professor, but it is also my cemetery. Everyone I have loved is either here beneath the waves or lost to the cruelty of the surface world. The Nautilus is all I have left." It was the most personal thing Nemo had ever said to them. It hung in the air like a confession. Then the moment passed. Nemo's shoulders straightened. His voice regained its usual firmness. "We will continue east," he said. "There are reefs ahead rich with life. The professor may find them instructive." He left the salon without another word. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned exchanged glances. For the first time, they had seen past the captain's iron exterior to the grief and loneliness beneath. It did not make their captivity more bearable, but it made Nemo more human. The reefs Captain Nemo had mentioned were unlike anything Aronnax had ever imagined. They appeared first as dark shapes on the horizon of the seafloor, then gradually resolved into vast structures. Walls of coral rising hundreds of feet, branching and twisting into forms that resembled cities, forests, entire landscapes built by countless tiny creatures over millennia. The Nautilus moved slowly through this wonderland, her lights illuminating the colors, reds and oranges, purples and greens, yellows so bright they seemed to glow from within. Fish swarmed in clouds so dense they blocked the view, then parted to reveal chambers and tunnels carved by the coral's growth. Aronnax stood at the glass, transfixed. Beside him, Nemo pointed out details. The symbiosis between certain fish and the coral, the way predators used the structure for ambush, the age of different formations based on their size and complexity. "Some of these corals are thousands of years old," Nemo said. "They were growing here when Rome was at its height. They will still be here long after our civilization has fallen." There was a melancholy to his tone, a suggestion that he believed humanity's time was limited, that the ocean would outlast them all. They spent days navigating the reefs, occasionally stopping so Aronnax could venture out in the diving suit to collect samples. He brought back fragments of coral, small shells, algae specimens. Nemo provided him with a fully equipped laboratory, tucked away in a corner of the ship, where he could study his finds under microscopes of extraordinary quality. It was during one of these reef explorations that they encountered something unexpected. The Nautilus came upon a lagoon, sheltered by a ring of coral, its waters shallow and clear. Anchored in the center was a ship, but not a sunken derelict like the ones they had seen before. This ship was intact, floating on the surface, sails furled, clearly inhabited. Nemo ordered the Nautilus to dive deeper, to hide beneath the reef's edge. "What is it?" Aronnax asked. "A pearling ship," Nemo said, his voice tight. "They dive here, harvesting oysters, exploiting the ocean for profit." "Surely that's not unusual," Aronnax ventured. "People have been pearling for centuries." Nemo's expression darkened. "They are not merely harvesting, they are destroying, ripping the oysters from their beds, taking everything, giving nothing back. They care nothing for the balance of this ecosystem, only for the wealth they can extract." He watched the ship for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "We will surface tonight," he said finally, "not to make contact, but to observe. I want to see what they are doing." That night, under cover of darkness, the Nautilus rose silently to the surface. Through the salon glass, now above the waterline, they could see the purling ship clearly. Lanterns hung from its masts. Voices carried across the water, rough and tired. Divers were descending even at this late hour, their air hoses trailing behind them as they were lowered into the depths. It was dangerous work, poorly equipped. Aronnax could see the strain on the men's faces when they surfaced, gasping, clutching bags of oysters. Nemo watched with something like rage in his eyes. "They are slaves," he said quietly, "forced to dive in conditions that will kill them within a few years. Their masters grow rich while they drown by inches." Conseil, usually so calm, looked troubled. "Can we not help them?" "How?" Nemo asked. "By revealing ourselves. By sparking fear and chaos. No, the world above operates by its own cruel logic. I left it behind. I will not re-enter it now." But Aronnax could see that Nemo was affected. His hands gripped the edge of the window frame tightly, knuckles white. The next morning, when the divers descended again, something happened. One of the men, young, perhaps 20, was pulled down by a current or perhaps by exhaustion. His air line tangled. He struggled, thrashing, and then went still, sinking slowly toward the reef below. Without a word, Nemo was gone, racing toward the diving chamber. Aronnax and the others followed, arriving just as Nemo sealed himself into one of the suits. He entered the airlock, and before anyone could speak, he was outside, swimming swiftly toward the drowning diver. Through the porthole, Aronnax watched as Nemo reached the man, cut the tangled line, and pulled him upward. The diver's crewmates hauled him to the surface, confused but grateful, unaware of where the help had come from. Nemo returned to the Nautilus, shedding the suit in silence. "Why did you do that?" Ned asked, genuinely surprised. "You just said you wouldn't interfere." Nemo didn't look at him. "I said I left the world. I didn't say I stopped being human." He walked away, disappearing into the depths of the ship. Aronnax realized then that Nemo was not the cold, detached figure he pretended to be. He was a man in exile, yes, filled with bitterness and grief. But he was also a man who could not entirely sever his connection to humanity, no matter how much he tried. The Nautilus dove once more, leaving the purling ship behind, heading back into the deep, where the world of men could not follow. Weeks passed, measured only by the rhythm of meals and sleep, and the slow progression of the Nautilus through water that changed in character as they moved. The Pacific gave way gradually to the Indian Ocean, warmer and richer, its currents carrying scents and flavors that Nemo said came from distant rivers and tropical shores. Aronnax had stopped asking where they were going. He had learned that Nemo followed no schedule but his own, guided by curiosity or perhaps by old memories that he never shared. The ocean was their home now, and home had no fixed address. They passed through straits where the water grew shallow, and the sunlight penetrated all the way to the seafloor, illuminating gardens of coral and schools of fish, so bright they seemed painted. They crossed trenches where the bottom fell away into darkness deeper than the Nautilus could safely reach, and strange lights flickered far below. Bioluminescent creatures, Nemo explained, living their entire lives in cold and pressure that would annihilate lesser beings. It was in these waters that they encountered one of the ocean's true wonders. Nemo announced it at breakfast, his tone carrying a rare note of anticipation. "We are near the coast of Ceylon," he said. "There is a place I wish to show you. A pearl fishery, but not like the one we saw before. This one is natural, undisturbed. The oysters here produce pearls of extraordinary size and quality. I thought the professor might appreciate the sight." They descended to a depth of perhaps 30 feet and approached a rocky shelf covered in clusters of oysters, their shells dark and rough, crowded together in colonies that stretched for hundreds of yards. The water here was warm, clear, filtered by the coral reefs nearby. Through the salon glass, Aronnax watched as Nemo guided the Nautilus to hover above the beds. Fish moved lazily among the oysters, feeding on plankton. The scene was peaceful, beautiful in its simplicity. "May we go outside?" Aronnax asked. "To examine them more closely," Nemo considered, then nodded. "But you must stay near the ship. These waters are not without danger." Once again, they donned the diving suits, and once again Aronnax felt the strange liberation of stepping into the ocean itself. He walked carefully across the oyster beds, kneeling to examine individual specimens. Some were as large as dinner plates, their shells encrusted with smaller organisms, tiny worlds unto themselves. Conseil was beside him, equally fascinated. Together they opened a few of the older, larger shells, and inside, nestled in the soft tissue, they found pearls. White, lustrous, some the size of peas, others larger. Nemo gestured for them to follow, leading them to a particular cluster of oysters at the edge of the bed. He pointed to one shell, noticeably larger than the others, wedged between two rocks. Aronnax approached it, and Nemo carefully pried it open. Inside was a pearl unlike any Aronnax had seen, perfectly spherical, the size of a small egg, glowing with an inner light that seemed almost alive. It was flawless, a miracle of nature that had taken years, perhaps decades, to form. Nemo made no move to take it. He simply closed the shell gently and stepped back, allowing the oyster to continue its work. It was a gesture of reverence, Aronnax realized. Nemo could have harvested the pearl, added it to whatever collection he kept aboard the Nautilus, but he chose not to. He preferred to let it remain here, growing in the darkness, belonging to the ocean. They were about to return to the ship when Aronnax noticed something moving in the water above them. A long, sinuous shape, darker than the surrounding blue. A shark, no, not a shark, something larger. A whale shark, its massive body gliding effortlessly through the water, mouth open to filter plankton. It passed directly overhead, close enough that Aronnax could see the patterns on its skin, the small fish that clung to its belly. It was magnificent, terrifying and beautiful at once. And then, from the opposite direction, another shape approached. Smaller, faster. An actual shark this time, a predator drawn perhaps by the vibrations they made walking across the seafloor. Nemo saw it and immediately gestured for them to return to the Nautilus. They moved as quickly as the suits allowed, but the shark was faster. It circled them once, its black eyes fixed on the strange intruders in its domain. Conseil stumbled over a rock and the shark veered toward him. Nemo stepped between them, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the lamplight. The shark hesitated, circled again, and then, as if deciding they were not worth the effort, turned and swam away into the blue distance. Back aboard the Nautilus, after they had shed the suits and caught their breath, Ned spoke up. "You carry a knife when you dive," he said to Nemo, "but you don't carry weapons elsewhere. Why?" "The ocean has its dangers," Nemo replied. "I respect them, but I do not fear them. Men, on the other hand, men I fear, and so I avoid them." It was as close as Nemo had come to explaining his philosophy. He feared not nature, which was honest in its violence, but humanity, which cloaked cruelty in words like civilization and progress. The Nautilus continued its journey through the Indian Ocean, and the days took on a dreamlike quality. Aronnax found himself losing track of time entirely. Weeks, months, he was no longer sure. The outside world felt increasingly distant, a memory from another life. They explored underwater caves lit by phosphorescent algae, caverns where the walls dripped with formations of calcite that looked like frozen waterfalls. They passed through forests of kelp so tall and dense that the Nautilus had to navigate carefully to avoid tangling in the fronds. One evening, they surfaced near a small, uninhabited island, and Nemo allowed them to go ashore. It was the first time in months that Aronnax had felt solid ground beneath his feet, and the sensation was strange, almost disorienting. They walked along the beach, collecting shells, feeling the sun on their faces. Ned stood at the water's edge, staring out at the horizon, and Aronnax knew he was thinking of escape, of the world beyond. But the island was remote, barren, with no sign of shipping routes or settlements. Even if they remained here, their chances of rescue were almost non-existent. After a few hours, Nemo called them back to the ship. The brief taste of freedom made their return to the Nautilus feel heavier, more oppressive. That night, Aronnax lay awake, listening to the hum of the engines, the distant sound of water moving past the hull. He thought about the pearl Nemo had left in its shell, growing unseen in the depths. He thought about the shark, circling with its cold, indifferent gaze. He thought about the surface world, with its wars and its cities, and its relentless hunger for more. And he wondered, for the first time, if Nemo might be right. If the ocean, for all its dangers, was a kinder home than the land had ever been. The Nautilus turned west, and Aronnax could feel the shift in the water, the change in temperature and salinity that marked their passage into new seas. Nemo announced their destination at dinner one evening, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been excitement or perhaps nostalgia. "We are approaching the Red Sea," he said, "and from there we will enter the Mediterranean through a passage known to very few." "A passage," Aronnax echoed. "You mean through the land, but the Suez Canal is man-made." "Yes," Nemo interrupted, "and slow and monitored and utterly unsuitable for the Nautilus." "No, Professor, I speak of a tunnel, a natural formation carved by water over countless millennia, connecting the two seas beneath the Isthmus of Suez. I call it the Arabian Tunnel." Aronnax could hardly believe it. A subterranean passage connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. If such a thing existed, it would be a geological marvel, unknown to science. "You are certain it's safe?" Conseil asked, ever practical. Nemo smiled faintly. "I have traveled it before. The Nautilus was built for such challenges." As they descended into the Red Sea, the water took on a different character. It was warmer, saltier, and rich with life. The coral reefs here were among the most vibrant Aronnax had seen. Reds and pinks and oranges, so vivid they seemed unreal, populated by fish of every conceivable shape and color. They passed over shipwrecks, ancient vessels resting on the sandy bottom, their hulls shattered and colonized by marine organisms. Nemo pointed out details. The style of construction that indicated a particular era, the cargo scattered around the wreck, amphorae, timbers, objects of daily life transformed into artifacts by time and salt. "The Red Sea has been a highway of trade for thousands of years," Nemo said. "Every civilization that touched its waters left behind traces. The ocean is the world's greatest museum, Professor. And unlike the museums on land, it requires no curators. The sea preserves everything." They dove deeper, following the contour of the seafloor as it sloped downward. The light from above faded, replaced by the artificial glow of the Nautilus's lamps. And then, in the distance, Aronnax saw it, a dark opening in the rock, wide enough for the ship to pass through, its entrance framed by formations of coral and stone. The Arabian Tunnel. Nemo stood at the helm, his hands steady on the controls. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting ballast, monitoring gauges. There was tension in the air, a recognition that this was not a routine passage. The Nautilus glided into the tunnel. Immediately, the world changed. The walls closed in on either side, dark rock illuminated in patches by the ship's lights. The ceiling was irregular, sometimes high enough to allow comfortable passage, sometimes so low that Aronnax felt certain they would scrape against it. But Nemo navigated with absolute confidence, his eyes fixed ahead, his movements precise. The tunnel twisted and turned, descending at times, then rising again. There were moments when the path narrowed to the point where the Nautilus barely fit, her hull scraping softly against stone with a sound that made Aronnax's teeth ache. But Nemo never hesitated, never slowed. Aronnax watched through the salon glass, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. This was a place no human had ever seen except for Nemo and his crew. A secret artery beneath the earth, hidden from maps and memory. They traveled for hours through the darkness. The tunnel seemed endless, and then, gradually, the walls began to widen. The water changed again, growing slightly cooler, less saline. Light appeared ahead, faint but growing stronger. The Nautilus emerged into the Mediterranean. The transition was remarkable. The Red Sea had been warm and vivid, teeming with tropical life. The Mediterranean was cooler, darker, its waters carrying the weight of history in a way Aronnax could almost feel. This was the sea of ancient Greece and Rome, of Phoenician traders and Egyptian pharaohs. Civilizations had risen and fallen along these shores, and the ocean had witnessed it all. Nemo brought the ship to a shallower depth, and they cruised along the coast, staying well beneath the surface but close enough to see the contours of the land above. Rocky cliffs, sandy beaches, the occasional outline of a harbor or city barely visible through the haze of distance and water. "Where are we?" Aronnax asked. "Off the coast of Crete," Nemo replied. "We will follow the coastline west toward Greece." Aronnax felt a pang of longing. Greece. He had visited Athens years ago, walked among the ruins of the Parthenon, stood in the theater at Epidaurus. The memory felt impossibly distant now, as if it belonged to another person entirely. Days later, Nemo made an unexpected announcement. "There is something I wish to show you," he said, "a sight that I believe will interest the professor greatly." They descended to a considerable depth, the water growing cold and dark. The Nautilus's light swept across the seafloor, revealing sand and rock and scattered debris. And then, rising from the sediment, shapes began to emerge. Columns, broken statues, walls half buried in sand, a city, an entire city submerged and lost. Aronnax pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He could see streets, recognizable even under the layers of silt. He could see the remains of buildings, their architecture still discernible despite centuries, no millennia of submersion. "What is this place?" he whispered. "Some believe it is Atlantis," Nemo said quietly. "Others say it is simply a coastal city, swallowed by an earthquake and the sea. I do not claim to know, but it is old, older than any empire you have studied, and it is beautiful in its way." They spent hours exploring the ruins, the Nautilus moving slowly over the drowned streets. Through the glass, Aronnax saw mosaics still intact, their colors muted but visible. He saw pottery, tools, the detritus of lives lived long ago. He saw a fountain, its basin filled with sand, a statue beside it of a figure whose features had been worn smooth by water and time. It was haunting. Whoever had lived here, they had been people like him, curious, hopeful, mortal. They had built homes, raised families, believed their city would endure. And now it was gone, claimed by the ocean, remembered only by the fish that swam through its empty halls. Nemo stood beside him, silent. Aronnax wondered what the captain thought when he looked at these ruins. Did he see a warning, a reminder of the impermanence of human achievement? Or did he find comfort in it, proof that all civilizations eventually fall, that the ocean outlasts everything? Finally, Nemo spoke. "The surface world believes it is eternal. It builds monuments, writes histories, declares its greatness. But the ocean remembers the truth. Everything returns to the water eventually. Everything is forgotten." Aronnax had no answer for that. He could only watch as the Nautilus left the ruins behind, the ancient city fading into the darkness once more, waiting for the next visitor who might never come. They surfaced that night, rising until the upper deck broke through into open air. Nemo allowed them to go outside, to stand beneath the stars for the first time in weeks. The night was clear, the Mediterranean calm. Above them, the sky was a field of light, constellations wheeling in their ancient patterns. Aronnax breathed deeply, tasting salt and wind, feeling the gentle roll of the waves. For a moment, he felt free. The ruins they had seen were only the beginning, Nemo told them the following morning. The Mediterranean floor was dotted with remnants of lost civilizations, cities swallowed by earthquakes or rising seas, forgotten by history but preserved in the cold depths. "But there is one sight," Nemo said, his dark eyes distant, "that surpasses all others, a place that exists at the boundary between legend and truth. I have visited it only twice before. I think it is time to return." He would say no more, and Aronnax did not press. He had learned that Nemo revealed information in his own time, according to his own inscrutable logic. The Nautilus changed course, moving south and west, deeper into the Mediterranean. They passed underwater mountains, volcanic formations that rose from the abyssal plain like the fingers of a buried giant. The water here was darker, colder, heavy with minerals and sediment. Aronnax spent his days at the glass, cataloguing what he saw, filling page after page of his journals. The fish here were different from those in the tropics. Slower, more reserved, adapted to the reduced light and the scarcity of food. Predators moved like shadows, efficient and ruthless. It was a harsher world than the coral gardens, but no less fascinating. Conseil worked beside him, as always, organizing specimens, taking measurements, offering observations in his calm, methodical way. Ned grew more restless with each passing day, pacing the salon, testing doors that remained locked, staring at the dark water as if willing it to reveal an escape route. 3 days into their journey, the seafloor changed dramatically. The flat plains gave way to ridges and valleys, formations of rock twisted and fractured as if the earth itself had been torn apart. Lava flows lay frozen in mid-descent, their surfaces dark and glassy. Steam vents released plumes of superheated water that rose in shimmering columns toward the surface far above. Volcanic activity, Aronnax murmured. This region must be geologically unstable. It was, Nemo said, appearing beside him. Long ago. What you see now is the aftermath of a cataclysm that reshaped this entire part of the ocean floor. Scientists on the surface theorize about it. They write papers, propose models, but they cannot see what I can see. They cannot know with certainty. And what do you see? Aronnax asked. Nemo pointed ahead. Look, the Nautilus descended further, her lights cutting through the murk. And then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. At first, Aronnax thought they were natural formations, pillars of stone carved by water and time. But as they drew closer, he realized they were too regular, too symmetrical. These were columns, massive and ancient, arranged in rows that suggested walls, courtyards, temples. The Nautilus moved between them, and the scale of what they were seeing became clear. This was not a single building. It was a city, vast beyond comprehension, spread across the valley floor in a grid that spoke of planning and intelligence. Aronnax could hardly breathe. "Is this?" he began, but the words caught in his throat. "Atlantis," Nemo said simply, "or what remains of it." The name hung in the air, heavy with legend and longing. Atlantis. The lost continent, the civilization that Plato had described as advanced beyond measure, destroyed in a single day and night by the wrath of the sea. "It can't be," Aronnax whispered. "Atlantis is a myth, a parable invented by Plato to illustrate a philosophical point." "Is it?" Nemo asked. "Then explain what you see before you." Aronnax had no answer, because the city stretching out beneath the Nautilus was undeniably real. Its columns stood 60 feet high, carved from stone that had resisted millennia of erosion. Its streets were paved with blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar had been needed. Its buildings, though collapsed and broken, still showed evidence of sophisticated architecture. Arches, domes, intricate carvings that the water had softened but not destroyed. The Nautilus glided over what appeared to be a central plaza. In the middle stood the shattered remains of a statue, its upper half long since toppled, its base still intact. The figure had been carved in the likeness of a man, robed and crowned, one hand raised as if in blessing or command. Around the plaza, buildings radiated outward in concentric circles, a design that suggested both beauty and purpose. Aronnax could see doorways, windows, the remains of staircases leading to upper floors that no longer existed. "How deep are we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 1,500 meters, Nemo replied. The city sank, taking its inhabitants with it. Some died in the initial catastrophe. Others drowned as the ocean rushed in. The lucky ones were crushed instantly by falling stone. It was a grim picture, but Aronnax could not deny its likelihood. He imagined the terror of those final moments. The ground shaking, the buildings collapsing, the water pouring in with unstoppable force. A civilization at its height, obliterated in minutes. "When did this happen?" Conseil asked, his voice hushed. "I cannot say with certainty," Nemo answered. "But based on the erosion patterns, the sediment accumulation, and the volcanic activity nearby, I estimate it occurred 9 to 10,000 years ago, long before any recorded history, long before the civilizations you study in your textbooks." Aronnax tried to absorb this information. If Nemo was correct, then human civilization was far older than anyone believed. The Egyptians, the Sumerians, they were not the first. Atlantis had come before, risen high, and fallen into legend. Nemo brought the Nautilus lower until they were skimming just above the streets. Through the glass, Aronnax could see details. Pottery shards scattered across a courtyard, the remains of what might have been a market. A bronze sword, green with verdigris, lying across a threshold. A mosaic floor, its tiles depicting sea creatures and waves, preserved by the very element that had destroyed the city. They came to a structure larger than the others, its entrance flanked by columns carved in the shape of gods or kings. Figures with stern faces and elaborate headdresses, their eyes still visible despite the incrustation of barnacles and coral. "A temple," Nemo said, "or perhaps a palace. I have explored its interior. Would you like to see?" Aronnax nodded, unable to speak. They suited up and ventured outside, walking across the stone streets of Atlantis with weighted steps. The experience was surreal, dreamlike. Aronnax felt as though he had stepped out of time itself, into a place that existed only in myth and now, impossibly, beneath his feet. They entered the great building, passing through doorways tall enough for giants. Inside, the darkness was absolute except for their lamps. The beams of light revealed walls carved with symbols, a script unlike any Aronnax had seen. There were images too, processions of people, ships with strange sails, ceremonies involving fire and water. They walked through chambers that had once been grand, their ceilings vaulted, their floors inlaid with precious stones that still glimmered faintly. Fish darted away from their lights. Eels coiled in the corners, watching with unblinking eyes. At the heart of the building, they found a chamber with a circular floor, its center dominated by a stone altar. Upon the altar lay objects: a crown of tarnished gold, a scepter, vessels of ceramic and metal, offerings to gods who had not saved this place. Nemo stood before the altar for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and led them back outside. When they returned to the Nautilus and removed their suits, Aronnax felt drained, as though he had witnessed something too vast for his mind to fully comprehend. Did they know? He asked Nemo. Did the people of Atlantis know the end was coming? Perhaps, Nemo said. Or perhaps it came so suddenly they had no time to understand. Either way, the ocean claimed them. And now the ocean is their only monument. That night, Aronnax sat in the salon, staring out at the dark shape of the ruins through the glass. Conseil had gone to sleep. Ned was somewhere else in the ship, brooding as he so often did. But Aronnax remained, unable to look away. He thought about the people who had walked those streets, who had worshipped in that temple, who had believed their city would endure forever. He thought about how quickly everything could vanish, how little trace remained of even the greatest works. And he thought about the Nautilus, this vessel that moved through the ruins like a ghost, carrying its own lost souls. Nemo, who had fled the surface world, and the 3 prisoners who could never return. In 1,000 years, he wondered, would anyone remember them? Would the Nautilus be discovered, resting on some distant ocean floor, her purpose and origin as mysterious as the city they now explored? The ocean, he realized, did not care. It preserved and it destroyed with equal indifference. It remembered everything and forgot everything in the same eternal moment. And somewhere in that thought, Aronnax found a strange, cold peace. The Nautilus left the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar, slipping past the Great Rock in darkness, undetected by the ships and fortifications above. Once in the Atlantic, Nemo changed course dramatically, turning south and then further south into waters that grew increasingly cold. "We are heading to the Antarctic," he announced one morning, his tone matter-of-fact, as if such a journey were commonplace. Aronnax felt a thrill of apprehension mixed with excitement. The Antarctic. The bottom of the world, largely unexplored, its coastlines barely charted. Few ships had ventured into those frozen waters and returned to tell of it. "Why?" Ned asked bluntly. "What's down there worth risking our lives?" "Everything worth discovering involves risk, Mr. Land," Nemo replied. "Besides, the Nautilus is more suited to those waters than any surface vessel. We can travel beneath the ice, where no ship can follow." As they traveled south, the water changed. It grew clearer, colder, the life within it becoming sparser but more specialized. They saw whales migrating, vast pods of them, their songs echoing through the hull in haunting, mournful tones. They passed icebergs, massive and white, their underwater bulk far larger than the portion visible above the surface. Aronnax was fascinated by the icebergs. Through the salon glass, he could see their intricate structure. Layers of compressed snow and ice formed over centuries, trapped air creating patterns of blue and white that shifted as the Nautilus's lights moved over them. Conseil took measurements, recorded temperatures, noted the species they encountered. Seals, penguins glimpsed through the glass as they dove for fish, strange gelid creatures that pulsed with bioluminescent light in the darkness. Ned remained sullen but watchful. Aronnax noticed he paid particular attention when they surfaced to replenish air, scanning the horizon as if hoping to see rescue ships, but there were none. They were alone in the most desolate waters on Earth. The temperature inside the Nautilus dropped despite the heating system. They wore heavier clothing, moved more slowly, conserved energy. The crew went about their duties with the same quiet efficiency, but even they seemed affected by the cold and the isolation. And then, one morning, Nemo called them to the salon. Through the glass, Aronnax saw a sight that took his breath away, a wall of ice, impossibly tall, stretching in both directions as far as he could see. It was the ice shelf, the edge of the Antarctic continent, a barrier that had defeated every explorer who had attempted to cross it. "We will go beneath," Nemo said. "The shelf extends underwater, but there is space beneath it. We can navigate between the ice and the seafloor if we are careful." "And if we're not careful?" Ned asked. Nemo's expression was grim. "Then we become part of the ice." The Nautilus descended. The water beneath the shelf was dark, the ice above them blocking all sunlight. They navigated by the ship's lights alone, moving slowly, Nemo at the helm with absolute concentration. Around them, the underwater landscape was alien. Pillars of ice descended from the shelf above, some of them reaching all the way to the seafloor, creating forests of frozen columns. The Nautilus wove between them, her hull occasionally scraping against ice with a sound that made Aronnax wince. They traveled this way for hours, perhaps days. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Aronnax watched through the glass, seeing shapes in the ice. Strange formations, frozen bubbles, the occasional carcass of a seal or fish trapped within the frozen matrix. Finally, they emerged on the other side of the shelf, and the ceiling of ice gave way to open water. They surfaced, and Nemo opened the upper hatch, allowing them to climb out onto the deck. The cold hit Aronnax like a physical blow. It was unlike any cold he had experienced, sharp, cutting, stealing the breath from his lungs. The sky was grey, heavy with clouds. The sea was calm but filled with ice fragments, chunks ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a house, all floating in slow, aimless patterns. And in the distance, visible through the gloom, was land. The Antarctic continent itself, a mass of ice and rock, barren and beautiful in its desolation. "We are the first," Nemo said quietly, standing beside Aronnax. "The first human beings to stand here at the true south." It was a moment of profound significance, and Aronnax felt it in his bones. They had reached a place no one had reached, seen what no one had seen. And yet the achievement felt hollow because it would never be recorded, never be known. They were prisoners, and their discoveries would die with them. They remained on the surface for only a few minutes before the cold drove them back inside. The Nautilus descended again, moving along the coast, exploring the underwater topography of the Antarctic shelf. The scenery was stark and spectacular. Mountains of ice rose from the depths, their peaks lost in the darkness above. Valleys carved by ancient currents stretched out like roads. And everywhere the ice, blue and white and crystalline, reflecting the Nautilus's lights in patterns that seemed almost alive. But then, disaster. They were navigating through a narrow channel between two ice walls when the temperature dropped sharply. Aronnax felt it through the hull, a sudden, intense cold that made the metal groan. "Captain," one of the crew called out, his voice urgent. Nemo was already moving, checking gauges, adjusting controls. "The water is freezing around us. We need to surface immediately." But when they tried to rise, the Nautilus would not respond. The ice above them had thickened, forming a cap that blocked their ascent. They were trapped beneath it. Nemo ordered full reverse, but the ice was closing in from all sides. They could hear it. A grinding, creaking sound as the water around them solidified, locking the Nautilus in a frozen grip. "We have to break through," Ned said, his voice tight with fear. "Drill through the ice, blast it something." "The ice is too thick," Nemo replied, his calm starting to fracture. "We need time." But time was what they didn't have. The air in the Nautilus was finite. Nemo had said they could last days on the reserves, but that assumed they could surface to refresh the tanks. If they remained trapped, they would suffocate. The crew worked frantically, heating the hull to melt the ice around them, using the propellers to create currents that might slow the freezing. But the Antarctic water was relentless, and the ice continued to thicken. Aronnax felt the fear rising in his chest. This was how it would end, he realized. Not in some dramatic battle, not in an accident, but in slow suffocation, entombed in ice at the bottom of the world. Conseil remained calm as always, but his face was pale. Ned paced the salon, fists clenched, cursing the cold, the ice, Nemo, the Nautilus, everything. Hours passed. The air grew stale. People began to move more slowly, their breath coming in labored gasps. Aronnax felt a headache forming behind his eyes, pressure building in his skull. And then a crack, faint but unmistakable. Nemo heard it too. He was at the controls instantly, listening, analyzing. "The ice is shifting," he said. Another crack. He ordered all power to the engines. The Nautilus strained, her hull shuddering with the effort. The ice groaned in response. And then, with a sound like thunder, the ice shattered. The Nautilus surged upward, breaking through the surface in an explosion of frozen fragments. Aronnax was thrown against the wall, heard shouts from the crew, felt the ship tilt wildly before righting herself. They were free. Nemo opened the vents and fresh air flooded in, cold but life-giving. Aronnax gasped, filling his lungs, feeling the headache recede, feeling life return. Around them, the broken ice floated in the dark water. The sky above was still grey, still threatening, but they were alive. Nemo stood at the helm, his face expressionless, but his hands were shaking. "We will leave this place," he said quietly. "We will head north. The Antarctic has tested us enough." No one argued. As the Nautilus turned away from the frozen continent, Aronnax looked back at the ice, at the place that had nearly become their tomb. He felt no desire to return. Some wonders, he realized, were better left unexplored. They fled north, the Nautilus cutting through the cold Atlantic waters with desperate speed, as if Nemo himself wanted to put as much distance as possible between the ship and the Antarctic ice. The temperature gradually rose, the water cleared. Life returned in abundance, dolphins racing alongside the hull, whales breaching in the distance, schools of fish so vast they darkened the water. Aronnax felt the tension aboard the ship slowly ease. The crew moved with less urgency, their faces less drawn. Even Nemo seemed to relax slightly, though his expression remained as unreadable as ever. They were somewhere east of South America, Aronnax estimated, though Nemo shared no precise coordinates. The ocean here was deep, thousands of meters. The bottom lost in darkness, even the Nautilus's lights could not penetrate. One afternoon, Aronnax was in the salon, sketching a species of jellyfish that had drifted past the glass, when Conseil came to him, his face troubled. "Professor," he said quietly, "the crew is agitated. Something is happening." Before Aronnax could respond, the Nautilus shuddered, not violently but enough to be felt. A bump against the hull, as if something large had brushed against them. Nemo appeared immediately, moving with the quick, controlled precision that indicated concern. "What was that?" Aronnax asked. "I'm not certain," Nemo replied, his eyes on the glass. "Something large. Very large." Another bump, harder this time. The Nautilus tilted slightly, then righted herself. Through the glass, Aronnax saw movement in the darkness beyond the lights. Shapes, indistinct but massive, circling. "Captain," one of the crew began, but Nemo silenced him with a raised hand. The shapes moved closer, and then suddenly one of them entered the light. Aronnax's breath caught. It was a squid, but not like any squid catalogued in scientific texts. This creature was enormous, its body the size of a small whale, its tentacles extending 30 feet or more, lined with suckers as large as dinner plates. Its eyes, when they caught the light, were the size of human heads, black and intelligent and utterly alien. "Giant squid," Nemo said, his voice tight. "Architeuthis. I have encountered them before, but never this many." "How many are there?" Ned asked, appearing beside them. "At least 7, Nemo said. Perhaps more." Another squid appeared, and another. They circled the Nautilus with disturbing coordination, as if communicating, planning. Their tentacles reached out, testing the hull, searching for weaknesses. "They're curious," Aronnax said, trying to keep his voice calm. "They'll investigate and then leave." But even as he spoke, one of the squids wrapped its tentacles around the Nautilus's propeller. The ship lurched. The engines strained. "They're attacking," Ned said. "Why would they attack?" "We're in their territory," Nemo replied. "Or perhaps they see the Nautilus as prey. It doesn't matter. We need to shake them off." He ordered full power to the engines. The Nautilus surged forward, but the squid held on, its tentacles gripping with terrible strength. More squids joined the assault, their bodies slamming against the hull, their tentacles wrapping around the viewing ports, blocking the light. The salon was plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the interior lamps. Through the glass, Aronnax could see the squid's flesh pressed against the surface, pale and rippling, the suckers leaving circular marks. "We can't outrun them while they're holding on," Nemo said. "We'll have to fight." "Fight," Aronnax repeated. "How do you fight something like that?" Nemo was already moving, issuing orders. The crew responded instantly, arming themselves with axes, harpoons, anything that could cut or stab. Nemo himself took up a massive blade, its edge gleaming in the lamplight. "We'll surface," he said. "Draw them into the open. When they try to follow, we'll cut them free." It was a desperate plan, but there was no alternative. The Nautilus could not move with the squids attached, and remaining still meant eventual suffocation as the creatures blocked the air vents. The ship rose swiftly, breaking through the surface with a violence that sent water cascading over the deck. The upper hatch opened, and Nemo's crew poured out, weapons ready. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned followed, though Aronnax had no weapon and even less idea of what to do. The scene that greeted them was nightmare made real. The ocean around the Nautilus churned with squid. Their tentacles thrashed in the air, reaching for the deck, for the crewmen, for anything they could grasp. Their beaks, massive and sharp, clicked with a sound like breaking bone. Nemo and his crew fought with fierce determination. Axes rose and fell, severing tentacles that reached too close. Harpoons were driven into the squids' bodies, eliciting jets of black ink that stained the water and the deck. But the squids did not retreat. If anything, they became more aggressive. One of them wrapped a tentacle around a crewman, pulling him toward the water. His screams were cut short as he was dragged beneath the waves. "No," Aronnax shouted, but there was nothing he could do. Ned grabbed a harpoon and drove it into the squid's eye. The creature recoiled, releasing its grip, but it was too late. The crewman was gone. Another squid lunged at the deck, its tentacles sweeping across the surface, knocking men down. Nemo struck at it with his blade, cutting deep into the flesh. The squid pulled back injured, but another immediately took its place. It was chaos. Blood and ink mixed in the water. Men shouted, some in fear, some in rage. The squid seemed endless, rising from the deep with relentless purpose. Aronnax found himself pressed against the side of the ship, trying to stay out of the way. Conseil was beside him, his face pale but his eyes fixed on the battle. Ned was in the thick of it, fighting alongside Nemo's crew with the same grim efficiency he had once used hunting whales. One of the squids wrapped a tentacle around the ship's railing, pulling itself partially onto the deck. Its beak snapped at the nearest crewman, missing by inches. Nemo leapt forward, driving his blade into the creature's head. It convulsed, its tentacles releasing and slid back into the water, but the effort cost him. Another squid lunged from the side, its tentacle wrapping around Nemo's leg, dragging him toward the edge. Without thinking, Aronnax grabbed an axe from the deck and brought it down on the tentacle. The blade bit deep, cutting through muscle and cartilage. The squid released Nemo, who scrambled back to safety. For a moment, their eyes met, and Aronnax saw something like gratitude there. Then the battle resumed. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the squids began to retreat. The injured ones sank into the darkness. The others hesitated, circling at a distance, their curiosity or aggression apparently sated. Nemo ordered everyone back inside. The crew obeyed, bloodied and exhausted, carrying the injured below. The hatch was sealed. The Nautilus dove, leaving the surface and the remaining squids behind. In the salon, Aronnax collapsed onto a bench, his hands shaking. Conseil sat beside him, silent. Ned stood at the glass, staring out at the now empty water. Nemo entered, his clothing torn, a gash on his arm that he ignored. "We lost 2 men," he said quietly, "dragged into the depths. There was nothing I could do." Aronnax had no words. He had witnessed death before, but never like this, never so sudden and violent. "Thank you, Professor," Nemo said, nodding toward him. "You saved my life." "It was instinct," Aronnax replied. "I didn't think." "The best actions often come from instinct," Nemo said. He looked at the 3 of them, Aronnax, Conseil, Ned, and for the first time there was something almost like kinship in his expression. "You fought alongside my crew. That means something." He left them then, to tend to his wounded and mourn his dead. Aronnax sat in silence, replaying the battle in his mind. He had come aboard the Nautilus as a prisoner, then as an observer, But today he had fought, he had bled, he had become, in some small way, part of Nemo's world. And he was not sure how he felt about that. The Nautilus turned north, following the warm currents of the Gulf Stream as it swept up the eastern coast of the Americas. The water here was different once again. Warmer, bluer, alive with creatures that thrived in the rich nutrients carried by the current. Aronnax tried to return to his observations, to his notes and sketches, but something had changed. The squid attack had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He kept seeing the crewman's face as he was pulled beneath the waves, hearing the screams, feeling the terror of those moments when it seemed the squids would overwhelm them all. Conseil noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Are you well, Professor?" he asked one morning as they sat in the salon. "I'm not sure," Aronnax admitted. "I keep thinking about those men, about how quickly it happened." "Death is always quick," Conseil said gently. "It's only the waiting that takes time." Aronnax had no response to that quiet wisdom. Ned, however, grew more agitated with each passing day. The squid attack had not frightened him. If anything, it had energized him, reminded him of what it felt like to fight, to struggle, to be alive in a way that captivity did not allow. "We need to escape," he said one evening, his voice low so only Aronnax and Conseil could hear. "That battle showed us something. Nemo is not invincible. The Nautilus is not invincible. If we're clever, if we plan carefully, we can get away." "And go where?" Aronnax asked. "We're in the middle of the ocean, Ned. Even if we reach the surface without a ship to rescue us, we drown." "Then we wait until we're near land," Ned insisted. "The Gulf Stream flows near the coast. Nemo has to surface eventually. When he does, we take one of the small boats, we row to shore, we're free." Aronnax wanted to dismiss the plan as impossible, but he couldn't. Because part of him, a part that had grown stronger since the squid attack, wanted to be free. Wanted to see Paris again, to walk on solid ground, to live a life that was his own rather than one dictated by Nemo's whims. "We'll need to watch for opportunities," Conseil said, surprising them both. Conseil, who never questioned, who never complained, was agreeing with Ned's plan. "Then we watch," Ned said. "And when the moment comes, we take it." But opportunities were scarce. Nemo seemed to sense the shift in their mood, the growing restlessness. He kept the Nautilus submerged for longer periods, avoided surfacing near coasts, watched them more carefully. Or perhaps Aronnax was imagining it. Perhaps Nemo was simply being Nemo, following his own inscrutable path through the ocean. Days became weeks. The Gulf Stream carried them north into cooler waters. They passed beneath fishing boats, their nets trailing down, harvesting the sea's bounty. They saw whales feeding on schools of herring, their mouths opening wide to engulf thousands of fish at once. Aronnax filled more notebooks. His collection of specimens grew. He discovered new species, documented behaviors no scientist had observed. It was work that should have made him happy, that should have fulfilled the purpose he had dedicated his life to. But it felt hollow, because no one would ever read these notes. No one would ever benefit from this knowledge. It would die with him or remain locked aboard the Nautilus forever. One afternoon, Nemo called him to the library. It was the first time in weeks they had spoken privately. "Professor," Nemo began, "I owe you an apology." Aronnax was surprised. "For what?" "For the squid attack. I should have anticipated it. Those waters are known for large cephalopods. I put my crew at risk, and I put you at risk. That was careless." "You couldn't have known they would attack," Aronnax said. "Marine life is unpredictable." "Perhaps." Nemo paused, then continued. "You fought well, Professor. You saved my life. I have not forgotten that. You would have done the same for me," Aronnax replied. Nemo smiled faintly. "Would I? I'm not certain. I have spent so long avoiding human connection that I'm not sure I remember how to value it. It was a moment of vulnerability, rare and fleeting." "Why do you live like this?" Aronnax asked quietly. "I know you've turned your back on civilization, but what did it do to you that was so terrible you would choose eternal exile?" Nemo's expression hardened. "The world of men is built on injustice, Professor, on the exploitation of the weak by the powerful. I witnessed it firsthand. I lost everything I loved to it, and I decided that if the world above would not change, then I would leave it behind." "But isolation is not the answer," Aronnax ventured. "Humanity is capable of great good as well as great evil. You yourself saved that pearl diver. You mourn your lost crew. You are not as separate from humanity as you pretend. Nemo looked at him for a long moment. Perhaps not. But I am separate enough. He stood, indicating the conversation was over. We will be passing near the coast of New England soon. There are shipwrecks there I wish to explore. You may find them interesting. He left the library, and Aronnax sat alone among the books, thinking. That night, Ned came to Aronnax's cabin, his eyes bright with urgency. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Nemo said we'll be near the coast." "That's our chance. How do you know we'll be able to surface?" Aronnax asked. "I've been watching the crew. There's a pattern. Every few days, they prepare the upper deck for airing. Tomorrow is one of those days. When they open the hatch, we make our move." Aronnax felt his heart racing. "And if we're caught, then we're no worse off than we are now," Ned said. "But if we don't try, we'll never be free." Conseil appeared in the doorway. "I will come with you," he said simply. Aronnax looked at both of them, Ned driven by his need for freedom, Conseil loyal to the end, following wherever Aronnax led, and he made his decision. "All right," he said, "tomorrow." We try. The next day passed in agonizing slowness. Aronnax could barely focus on his observations. Every sound made him jump, certain that Nemo had discovered their plan. But Nemo seemed preoccupied, spending most of his time at the helm, navigating through waters thick with debris from old storms. Evening came. The crew prepared the upper deck, just as Ned had predicted. The hatch was opened to let in fresh air. Ned gave the signal. They moved. It should have worked. They reached the ladder, started climbing toward the open hatch and the night sky beyond. Freedom was just a few feet away. But then alarms sounded. Lights flashed. The hatch began to close. Nemo appeared, his face dark with fury. "Where do you think you're going?" Ned pushed forward, trying to reach the hatch before it closed completely. Nemo's crew grabbed him, pulling him back. Aronnax and Conseil were seized as well, dragged back down into the ship. They were brought to the salon and left there under guard. The hatch sealed. The alarms fell silent. Nemo stood before them, his expression colder than Aronnax had ever seen it. "I saved you from drowning," he said quietly. "I gave you marvels to witness, knowledge to gain, and this is how you repay me." "With betrayal, we are prisoners," Ned said defiantly. "We have a right to try to escape." "You have no rights aboard my ship," Nemo replied. "Only the privileges I choose to grant. And you have just forfeited them." He turned to his crew. "Take them to the confinement chamber. They will remain there until I decide otherwise." As they were led away, Aronnax caught one last glimpse of the salon, of the ocean beyond the glass. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. The confinement chamber was small and dark, with no porthole, no view of the ocean that had become their world. It contained only 3 narrow bunks and a single dim light that cast long shadows on the metal walls. They were locked in, alone with their thoughts and their regrets. Hours passed, perhaps days. Without windows or clocks, without the rhythm of meals or the hum of the engine's changing pitch, time became meaningless. They existed in a perpetual present, waiting for something, anything, to change. Ned paced constantly, his energy unable to find outlet in the confined space. He would walk from wall to wall, count his steps, turn and walk back, over and over. His frustration was palpable, a living thing that filled the small room. Conseil sat quietly on his bunk, hands folded in his lap, his face serene despite their circumstances. Aronnax envied that calm, that ability to accept what could not be changed. Aronnax himself lay on his bunk and tried to think, to process what had happened. They had attempted escape. They had failed. And now they were being punished, though whether the punishment was temporary or permanent, he had no way of knowing. Would Nemo keep them locked here forever? Would he release them eventually, once his anger cooled? Or would he, in his fury at their betrayal, decide they were more trouble than they were worth and simply dispose of them? The ocean, after all, kept secrets well. The thought sent a chill through Aronnax that had nothing to do with the temperature. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. A crewman entered, his face expressionless, and set down a tray containing bread, water, and some kind of fish paste. He left without speaking, without making eye contact, and the lock clicked again behind him. They ate in silence. The food was tasteless, or perhaps their fear had stolen their ability to taste. It didn't matter. They ate because they needed to survive, and survival required fuel. More time passed. Aronnax dozed, woke, dozed again. He dreamed of the surface world, of Paris in spring, of walking through gardens where the air smelled of flowers and earth. He dreamed of sunlight on his face, of the simple pleasure of choosing where to go, what to do, when to sleep. He woke to find Conseil watching him. "You were calling out," Conseil said gently. "In your sleep, what did I say? You were asking to go home." Aronnax said nothing. What was there to say? Home was impossibly far away, separated not just by distance, but by the iron will of a man who had renounced the world. And then suddenly the Nautilus shuddered, not the gentle bump of a passing creature or the soft scrape of coral. This was violent, sustained, as if the ship were under attack. The entire vessel rang like a struck bell. The lights flickered. The room tilted sharply to one side, throwing them against the wall. Aronnax grabbed at the bunk to steady himself, heard Ned curse, saw Conseil bracing himself in the corner. "What's happening?" Conseil asked, his voice tight with alarm. "I don't know," Aronnax replied, his heart hammering. The shuddering continued. They heard shouting from somewhere in the ship, the sound of running feet, the hum of the engines rising to a desperate roar. The Nautilus was moving fast, faster than Aronnax had ever felt her move, and there was something violent about it, something that spoke of rage rather than caution. Then another impact, harder, the sound of metal grinding against metal. And then silence. The Nautilus righted herself slowly. The engines returned to their normal rhythm, that steady, almost peaceful hum. They waited, listening, barely breathing. The door opened. Nemo stood there, backlit by the corridor lights, his face haggard, his eyes wild with something that might have been grief or fury or both. "Come with me," he said. His voice was rough, as if he had been screaming. It was not a request. They followed him through the corridors, past crewmen who looked away as they passed, their faces pale and troubled. Something terrible had happened. Aronnax could feel it in the air, in the way the ship itself seemed to hold its breath. Nemo led them to the salon. He said nothing, simply gestured toward the glass. Aronnax looked out and his blood ran cold. A ship, a warship, its hull shattered, sinking slowly into the depths. It was already half submerged, the water pouring through massive rents in its side. Men were in the water, tiny figures swimming desperately toward the distant surface, but they were too deep, far too deep. The pressure at this depth would crush them before they could rise even halfway. Aronnax watched, horrified, as one by one they stopped swimming. Their bodies went limp, arms and legs drifting, and then they sank, pulled down by the weight of their uniforms and boots, falling into the darkness below. "What did you do?" Aronnax breathed, unable to look away from the dying men. "What I had to do," Nemo said, his voice hollow, empty of everything but pain. "That ship was hunting us. They have been hunting us for weeks. They fired on the Nautilus. They tried to destroy us. I rammed them." "You killed them," Aronnax said, turning to face him. "All of them, you murdered them." "They would have killed us," Nemo replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It was them or us. I chose us." "What flag did they fly?" Ned asked, his voice quiet. Nemo did not answer. He simply stood at the glass, watching the wreckage settle onto the ocean floor, watching the bodies drift in the current like falling leaves. His face was a mask of anguish, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Who were they?" Aronnax demanded, stepping closer. "What nation sent that ship?" Nemo turned on him, and the fury in his eyes was terrible to see. "The nation that destroyed my life. The nation that took everything I loved. They hunted me then, when I was still part of their world, and they hunt me now, and I will sink every ship they send until they learn that I cannot be destroyed." It was the first time Nemo had spoken of his past with such raw, unfiltered emotion, and the pain in his voice was terrible to hear. It was the sound of a man whose wounds had never healed, whose grief had curdled into something dark and all-consuming. "I had a family, Professor," Nemo said, his voice breaking. "A wife, children. They were beautiful, innocent, everything good in this world. And that nation, in its greed and its cruelty, took them from me. They died because of what I knew, because of what I could create. Because I refused to let them use my inventions for their wars, their conquests. They punished me by destroying the only things I loved." He gestured toward the sinking ship, toward the dead men drifting past the window. "So yes, I killed them, and I will kill more. Every ship that comes after me, every sailor who follows their orders. Because the world above deserves no mercy, it has shown me none." The words hung in the air, heavy with decades of rage and sorrow. Aronnax felt something break inside him. He understood grief, he understood loss, but this was beyond grief. This was a wound that had festered for so long it had become part of Nemo's identity, inseparable from who he was. "Captain," Conseil said gently, always the voice of quiet reason, "revenge will not bring them back." "No," Nemo agreed, his shoulders sagging, "but it satisfies something. It gives me purpose. Without it, I am nothing but a ghost, haunting this ocean with no reason to continue." He walked away then, leaving them alone in the salon, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The three of them stood in silence, watching the drowned sailors' bodies drift in the current. Some were still young, their faces smooth and unlined. Others were older. All of them were dead, casualties of a war they probably didn't understand, killed by a man they had never met, whose very existence was supposed to be impossible. "We have to get away from him," Ned whispered, his voice urgent. "He's insane, Aronnax. He's going to get us all killed. If not by his enemies, then by his own madness." Aronnax wanted to argue, wanted to defend Nemo, to explain that beneath the madness was a man who had suffered more than any person should suffer. But he couldn't, because Ned was right. Nemo was brilliant, yes, tragic, yes. But he was also dangerous, driven by hatred that had long since eclipsed reason, consumed by a need for vengeance that would never be satisfied. "Next time we have a chance," Aronnax said quietly, still watching the bodies drift, "we take it. No hesitation, no looking back." Ned and Conseil nodded, their faces grim. That night, the Nautilus moved through dark waters, running fast and deep, as if Nemo were trying to outrun his own demons. But demons, Aronnax knew, could not be outrun. They followed wherever you went, patient and relentless, waiting for the moment when exhaustion or despair lowered your defenses. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the men who had died. They had been following orders, doing their duty. They had believed they were serving their country, protecting their people. They had not deserved to drown in the cold darkness, their last moments filled with terror and the crushing pressure of the deep. And yet he understood Nemo's anger, understood what it meant to lose everything you loved, to feel powerless in the face of injustice, to watch as the world moved on, indifferent to your suffering. The line between victim and monster, he realized, was far thinner than he had ever imagined. It was a line Nemo had crossed long ago, perhaps without even realizing it. Somewhere in the depths of the ship, he heard music. Nemo playing the pipe organ in his private quarters, the notes mournful and beautiful, rising and falling like waves. It was a requiem, either for the dead men floating in the ocean above them, or for Nemo himself, or for the world he had lost and could never reclaim. It was the saddest sound Aronnax had ever heard. The days following the attack were different. The atmosphere aboard the Nautilus had changed, become heavier, darker, as if the ship itself mourned what had happened. The crew moved through their duties with mechanical precision, but their faces were troubled, their eyes distant, haunted by the memory of drowning men. Even they, loyal as they were to Nemo, devoted to his vision of a life apart from the world, had been shaken by what they had witnessed. Nemo himself became a ghost. He retreated to his quarters and did not emerge. Meals were brought to him, left outside his door, and often they remained untouched, the food growing cold as the hours passed. The sound of the organ drifted through the ship at all hours, day and night, blending into one continuous vigil. The music was always mournful, always expressing something too deep for words, a grief that could find no other outlet. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned were given their freedom once more, allowed to move about the ship without guards or locked doors, but it felt hollow. They were still prisoners, still trapped beneath the waves with a man whose grip on reason seemed to be slipping with each passing day. The Nautilus moved north, following currents that Aronnax no longer tried to track. His journals lay untouched. His specimens sat uncatalogued. He had lost the will to document what he saw, to pretend that any of this knowledge would ever reach the world above. They passed beneath ice floes, through waters so cold that frost formed on the inside of the viewing glass. The world outside became grey and lifeless, as bleak as their prospects. Fish were scarce here. The ocean felt empty, desolate, a wasteland of cold and darkness. "We are heading toward Norway," Ned said one evening, studying the few landmarks visible through the murk. I recognize these waters. I hunted whales here once, years ago. How close is the coast? Aronnax asked, a spark of hope flickering despite himself. Close enough, Ned replied, his eyes bright with renewed possibility. If we can get to the surface, if we can take the small boat while Nemo is distracted, we might make it to land before he realizes we're gone. He'll realize, Conseil said quietly. He always realizes. The man sees everything. Then we'll have to be faster, Ned insisted. We've had months to observe the ship, to learn its rhythms, its patterns. We know when the crew changes shifts. We know which areas are less monitored. This time we'll succeed. Aronnax wanted to believe him. But fear had settled into his bones during the long months aboard the Nautilus. A cold certainty that escape was impossible, that they would die aboard this vessel, whether by Nemo's hand or by some disaster the ocean would eventually provide. And then, one night, the Nautilus began to shake. It was subtle at first, a vibration in the hull that could have been attributed to the engines running at an unusual speed. But it grew stronger, more violent, until the entire ship was shuddering, the metal groaning under stresses it was not designed to withstand. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned rushed to the salon. Through the glass, they saw water moving in ways water should not move. It was swirling, spinning, forming a massive vortex that pulled everything toward its center like the mouth of some vast, hungry creature. A whirlpool, Ned breathed, his face pale. A maelstrom. The word sent ice through Aronnax's veins. The maelstroms of the Norwegian coast were legendary, massive whirlpools capable of dragging down entire ships, legends that had terrified sailors for centuries, stories told in ports to explain why men sometimes never came home. The Nautilus was caught in its grip. Nemo appeared, moving swiftly to the helm despite his exhaustion, despite the weeks he had spent in isolation. His face was haggard, his beard untrimmed, his eyes hollow with grief and sleeplessness. But his hands were steady as he gripped the controls and tried to steer the ship away from the vortex. "All power to engines," he shouted, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Reverse thrust. Full ballast," the crew obeyed instantly, their training taking over despite their fear. But the Nautilus barely responded. The whirlpool was too strong, its pull inexorable, a force of nature that cared nothing for human engineering or ingenuity. The ship began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, the centrifugal force pressing them against the walls. Through the glass, Aronnax watched the world tilt and rotate. Water churned in massive spirals, layers of current moving at different speeds, creating a hypnotic, terrible pattern. Debris circled with them, logs torn from distant shores, seaweed in vast, tangled masses, the remains of smaller boats, perhaps even the bones of ships that had been caught here decades ago and never escaped. "We're going to be pulled under," Ned shouted over the roar of the water and the screaming engines. "We're already under," Aronnax shouted back, gripping the edge of a table to keep from being thrown across the room. The Nautilus spun faster. Objects inside the ship began to slide, crashed to the floor in cascades of breaking glass and splintering wood. Books tumbled from shelves in the library, pages fluttering like wounded birds. Instruments shattered. Somewhere in the depths of the ship, a pipe burst, and the sound of rushing water added to the chaos. Nemo fought the whirlpool with every skill he possessed, every trick of navigation and engineering he had learned in his years beneath the waves. But the ocean was stronger than any man, stronger than any machine. The Nautilus was a toy in its grip, helpless as a leaf in a storm. "The small boat," Ned grabbed Aronnax's arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "If we can get to it, launch it before we are pulled too deep." "We'll drown," Aronnax objected, his voice nearly lost in the noise. "We'll drown anyway if we stay here." Ned's eyes were wild but determined. "At least out there we have a chance." Aronnax looked at Conseil, his loyal friend who had followed him to the ends of the earth without complaint, who had never once questioned or abandoned him. Conseil nodded once, his face pale but determined. "Go," Nemo said, surprising them. He did not take his eyes from the controls, did not turn to look at them. "If you can escape, then escape. I will not stop you." "Not this time." There was resignation in his voice, a finality that suggested he did not expect to survive, that he had perhaps chosen not to survive. The Nautilus was his creation, his home, his tomb. If she went down, he would go down with her. They ran, through corridors that tilted at impossible angles, clinging to rails and doorframes to keep from falling. Past crewmen struggling to keep the ship operational, their faces set with the grim determination of men who know death is approaching. Toward the chamber where the small boat was stored, their only hope of salvation. They reached it, pried open the hatch with hands made clumsy by fear and cold. They climbed inside the boat, barely large enough for three, designed for short excursions, not open ocean voyaging. But it was their only chance, their last chance. Ned worked the release mechanism with frantic efficiency. The outer door opened, and water rushed in, cold and violent, equalized the pressure with a sound like thunder. The boat floated free of its moorings, carried by the sudden current. They were outside the Nautilus, in the maelstrom itself. The small boat spun immediately, caught in the whirlpool's irresistible current. Water surged over the sides, soaking them to the skin, threatening to swamp the tiny vessel. Ned grabbed the oars and tried to row, his powerful arms straining, but it was futile. The maelstrom controlled them now, and all they could do was hold on and pray. Around and around they went, faster and faster, spiraling inward toward the deadly center where the water disappeared into some unfathomable depth. Aronnax clutched the sides of the boat, his knuckles white, certain that at any moment they would capsize, that the ocean would claim them as it had claimed so many before. He looked back, trying to see the Nautilus through the spray and chaos, wanting one last glimpse of the extraordinary vessel that had been his prison and his wonder. But the water was too violent, the darkness too complete. The great submarine was lost to sight, swallowed by the maelstrom along with all its wonders, all its secrets, all its ghosts. And then, impossibly, miraculously, the spinning began to slow. The whirlpool's grip weakened. They were being pushed outward, away from the center, riding a current that carried them toward calmer water at the vortex's edge. Ned rowed with desperate energy, and slowly, painfully, they pulled free. The maelstrom receded behind them, a churning mass of water and foam and death, still spinning, still hungry, but releasing them from its grip. The night grew quiet. The stars appeared overhead, bright and indifferent to the drama below. The water calmed. They were on the surface. They were free. Aronnax looked back one last time, searching the darkness for any sign of the Nautilus, but there was nothing. Only water, black and calm and eternal, keeping its secrets as it always had, as it always would. "Is he dead?" Conseil asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Aronnax replied, and he realized with surprise that he hoped the answer was no. Despite everything, despite the violence and the madness and the deaths, he hoped Nemo had survived, that somewhere beneath the waves, the Nautilus still moved, carrying its lonely captain through the depths he had claimed as his kingdom. They rode through the night, taking turns, conserving their strength. As dawn broke cold and grey over the horizon, they saw land. The coast of Norway, rocky and wild, and more beautiful than anything Aronnax had ever seen. Fishermen found them hours later, half dead from exhaustion and exposure, and brought them to a village where the houses were painted bright colors against the grey sky. They were given warm clothes, hot food, shelter by a fire that seemed like a miracle after so long in the cold depths. The people asked no questions, simply offered the kindness that strangers in need deserve. And slowly, over days and weeks, Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned returned to the world of men. And so our story comes to rest, like a ship finally dropping anchor after months at sea, settling into calm harbor waters with a long, quiet sigh of relief and exhaustion. The waves that carried it so far grow still. The wind that filled its sails falls silent. The journey, with all its wonders and terrors, reaches its end. Professor Pierre Aronnax returned to Paris in the spring of 1868, nearly 2 years after he had departed on what was supposed to be a brief scientific expedition. He returned to his apartment near the Jardin des Plantes, to his books and his specimens, to the life he had built before the ocean claimed him. Conseil returned with him, as faithful in freedom as he had been in captivity, resuming his duties as if the extraordinary months beneath the waves had been merely an extended holiday, something to be quietly filed away in memory, but not dwelt upon. Ned Land, restless as ever, could not bear the confines of city life. He stayed in Paris only long enough to give his testimony to the naval authorities, to be examined by doctors who found him physically sound, but deeply changed in ways they could not measure or name. Then he departed for the northern seas he had always loved, returning to his life as a whaler and harpooner, though he swore he would never venture into deep water again, never hunt in places where the ocean floor fell away into unknowable darkness. They told their story, of course. How could they not? They had witnessed miracles and horrors both. They had traveled farther beneath the ocean's surface than any human beings in history. They had walked through underwater forests and explored drowned cities. They had met a man who had built a kingdom in the depths, a brilliant, tormented soul who had chosen exile over compromise, who had turned his back on the entire world above. But the world received their account with skepticism that bordered on mockery. A submarine vessel capable of traversing the world's oceans at impossible speeds. Scientists shook their heads and smiled indulgently. An underwater craft powered by electricity extracted from seawater. Engineers examined the mathematics and declared it impossible with current technology. A captain who had renounced all nations and lived beneath the waves. Philosophers called it a romantic fantasy, the kind of story men tell themselves when reality proves too disappointing. Cities older than recorded history, lying perfect and preserved on the ocean floor. Giant squid the size of whales, with intelligence and coordination that suggested something beyond mere animal instinct. Forests of kelp growing in the perpetual twilight of the deep, lit by creatures that made their own light. Pearls the size of eggs, growing untouched in oyster beds that no human hand had ever harvested. It sounded like fantasy, like the fever dreams of men who had suffered too long at sea, their minds unmoored by isolation and salt air and the endless rocking of waves. Like a Jules Verne novel, something invented for entertainment rather than truth. Some believed, of course, mostly children who had not yet learned to discount wonder. Dreamers and artists who wanted the world to be larger and stranger than maps suggested. A few scientists, the younger ones who had not yet calcified into professional skepticism, who remembered what it felt like to be awed by discovery. But most did not believe. Newspapers ran sensational stories for a week, selling copies with lurid illustrations of sea monsters and underwater palaces, then moved on to other spectacles, other scandals. Naval authorities investigated briefly, interviewed the 3 survivors, examined them for signs of delusion or deception, found no physical evidence of an underwater vessel, and quietly closed their files. The mystery of the creature that had terrorized shipping lanes in 1866 was officially attributed to misidentification of whales, hysteria, and the unreliability of sailors' reports. The Abraham Lincoln, damaged in the encounter, had limped back to port and been repaired. Her crew told conflicting stories. Some supported Aronnax's account. Others claimed they remembered nothing unusual, just a collision with something in the dark, perhaps a reef or a floating log. Memory, the officials noted, was unreliable. Trauma could invent fictions as easily as it could suppress truths. And after a while, Aronnax stopped trying to convince them. He had learned something about human nature during his time aboard the Nautilus, something that Captain Nemo had understood long before. People believe what they need to believe. They construct the world in their minds and then reject anything that does not fit the construction. Truth is less powerful than comfort, and the truth Aronnax carried was deeply uncomfortable. He had his journals, at least. Pages and pages filled with observations and sketches, drawn in careful detail during quiet moments aboard the Nautilus. He had specimens carefully preserved in alcohol-filled jars, strange creatures from depths where sunlight never reached, their bodies adapted to pressure and cold in ways that defied conventional biology. He had his memories, vivid and strange, more real than any dream, more persistent than any forgetting. That would have to be enough. It had to be enough because it was all he had. But late at night, when Paris was quiet and the streets empty of everything but fog and the yellow glow of gaslights, he would stand at his window overlooking the garden and think of the ocean. Not the ocean as it appeared from shore, picturesque and manageable, but the ocean as he had known it aboard the Nautilus. Vast and mysterious and beautiful beyond words, holding more life and diversity than all the land, home to wonders that made human achievements seem small and temporary. He would remember the wonder of gliding through coral gardens where colors bloomed in impossible profusion, where every surface was alive with movement and growth, where fish moved in clouds so dense they blocked the light. He would remember walking among ruins older than any empire, structures built by hands and minds that had turned to dust millennia before Egypt raised its first pyramid. He would remember seeing creatures no other scientist had documented, animals that existed at the very edge of what life could sustain, thriving in conditions that should have been fatal. And he would remember Nemo. Captain Nemo, brilliant and broken, a man who had chosen exile over compromise, who had built a world beneath the waves because the world above had failed him too profoundly to forgive. A man driven by grief and genius in equal measure, who had shown Aronnax wonders and horrors, knowledge and despair, beauty and violence all tangled together until they could not be separated. Was Nemo still alive? The question haunted Aronnax, followed him through his days like a shadow, invaded his dreams at night with images of the maelstrom and the sinking submarine and the dark water swallowing everything. He had no answer. No one did. No one could. The maelstrom could have destroyed the Nautilus, that was certain. Those whirlpools off the Norwegian coast were legendary for their violence, capable of dragging down ships far larger and sturdier than the small boat that had carried Aronnax and his companions to safety. The forces involved were tremendous, the pressure and turbulence enough to crush even the Nautilus's reinforced hull, to send her and her captain spiraling down into the depths forever, adding them to the countless other secrets the ocean floor held. Or perhaps Nemo had escaped. He was, after all, the finest navigator Aronnax had ever witnessed, a man who understood the ocean's moods and movements with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. Perhaps he had used that extraordinary skill to navigate through the whirlpool's deadly grip, reading the currents, finding the narrow path between destruction and survival. Perhaps he had surfaced in some quiet fjord after they had gone, assessed the damage to his vessel, and set about repairs with the same methodical perfectionism he brought to everything. Perhaps even now the Nautilus moved through deep water, lights glowing in the eternal darkness, her engines humming their steady song, carrying Nemo on an endless voyage through waters where no other vessel dared go. Sometimes Aronnax hoped for the former. Death, at least, would have brought Nemo peace. It would have released him from the grief and rage that had consumed him, corroded his brilliance into something dark and dangerous. It would have been an ending, and endings, Aronnax had learned, could be merciful. But more often, if he was honest with himself, he hoped for the latter. Because for all his flaws, for all his violence and madness and the blood on his hands, Nemo had shown Aronnax something precious beyond measure. The ocean as it truly was, not as maps and textbooks and polite scientific papers described it, but as it existed in reality. Vast and mysterious and beautiful, yes, but also ruthless, indifferent. A force of nature that cared nothing for human stories, human morality, human needs. The ocean took without asking permission and gave without expecting gratitude. It preserved and it destroyed with equal patience. It was life's origin and perhaps its ultimate destination. Captain Nemo had understood this in a way few people could. He had loved the ocean with a devotion that bordered on worship, seen in it a purity that the surface world, with all its politics and cruelties and hypocrisies, could never match. And in that love, despite his bitterness toward humanity, despite the violence that had stained his hands with the blood of desperate, drowning men, there had been something pure, something almost holy. The ocean, Aronnax came to understand in the years after his return, was more than water and salt, more than a barrier between continents or a highway for commerce or a source of food and wealth. It was a world unto itself, covering most of the planet, holding secrets that humanity had barely begun to discover. Scientists of his era, for all their confidence and proclamations, knew almost nothing about the deep ocean. They mapped coastlines and measured currents. They catalogued fish and shells found in shallow waters, but the abyss remained utterly mysterious. And perhaps it was meant to remain so. Perhaps some places were not meant for human eyes, some knowledge not meant for human minds. The ocean kept its secrets well, and maybe that was as it should be. Aronnax thought often about the crew, those silent men who had served Nemo with absolute loyalty, who had asked no questions and offered no judgments, who had simply lived their lives in the depths and seemed genuinely content to do so. They had spoken little, these men, and when they did speak it was in a language Aronnax never quite identified, something that seemed cobbled together from many tongues, a private vocabulary for a private kingdom. What had happened to them? Had they survived the maelstrom? Had they scattered to distant shores after the Nautilus sank, trying to build new lives in a world that would never understand them? Or had they chosen to go down with the ship, unable or unwilling to return to a surface world that held nothing for them, that could never measure up to the wonders they had witnessed? He imagined them sometimes, these ghost sailors, walking streets in foreign cities, speaking languages they had half forgotten, doing ordinary work with hands that had once operated the most advanced machinery on Earth. He imagined them lying awake at night, remembering the silence of the deep, the bioluminescent creatures that lit their path, the feeling of absolute freedom that came from living outside all laws and nations and social conventions. If they had survived, he suspected they were profoundly lonely. You could not witness what they had witnessed, live as they had lived, and then return to ordinary existence without feeling the poverty of it. He thought about Conseil, asleep in the next room of their shared apartment, content to be home, but forever changed by what they had witnessed. Conseil spoke little of their time aboard the Nautilus, maintained his usual calm efficiency, organized Aronnax's specimens and took his notes, and tidied their rooms with the same methodical care he had always shown. But sometimes Aronnax would catch him staring out windows, his eyes distant and longing, as if he were looking past the Paris rooftops to some other place entirely, some deeper place where the light was different and the rules did not apply. "Do you miss it?" Aronnax asked him once. Conseil had considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I miss the certainty of it," he said finally. Aboard the Nautilus, everything was clear. Our purpose was to observe, to learn, to witness. Here, he gestured at the window at the city beyond. "Here there are too many choices, too much noise. I know I should prefer freedom, Professor, but sometimes I think captivity was simpler." Aronnax understood. He felt it too. And Ned Land, somewhere on the northern seas, harpooning whales as he had always done, living the free, simple life he had always craved. Ned wrote occasionally, his letters arriving from various ports, always brief, always restless. He spoke of successful hunts and dangerous storms and the men he worked with. But even Ned, practical and grounded and skeptical of anything that could not be caught or eaten, admitted in one letter that no whale, no matter how massive, could compare to the marvels they had seen beneath the waves. That surface life felt somehow smaller after the vastness of the deep, flatter, less real. "I thought I wanted my old life back," he wrote, "and I got it. But it doesn't fit anymore, Professor. It's like putting on a coat that used to be comfortable and finding it's too tight across the shoulders. I can't explain it better than that." Aronnax could not explain it better either. They had been changed, all three of them. They had been taken down into the depths and shown things that rewrote their understanding of the world, and now the surface world felt like a stage set, flimsy and unconvincing. The world moved on, as the world always does, indifferent to individual stories and private transformations. New scientific discoveries were made, new technologies developed. Ships grew faster, more efficient, their engines more powerful. The ocean was mapped with increasing accuracy, its depths plumbed by brave men in primitive diving bells and weighted suits that could descend perhaps 50 feet before the pressure became unbearable. But none of it matched the Nautilus. None of it came close to what Nemo had achieved alone, in exile, driven by nothing but his own genius and his need to escape the world that had taken everything from him. Aronnax published a book eventually, several years after his return, when enough time had passed that he could be somewhat objective about the experience. He titled it simply 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a reference to the distance they had traveled horizontally rather than their depth, though many readers misunderstood this detail. He wrote the account carefully, stripped of its more fantastic elements where he could, framed as a factual narrative rather than speculation or fantasy. He included detailed observations of marine life, descriptions of underwater topography, theoretical discussions of submarine travel and electrical propulsion. Critics were divided. Some praised his descriptive powers, his obvious love of the ocean, the vividness of his prose. Others dismissed it as imaginative fiction, well-written but fundamentally untruthful, the kind of scientific romance that was becoming fashionable in literature. Fellow scientists politely ignored it, too embarrassed to debate whether it was truth or invention, not wanting to lend credibility to claims they found impossible. But letters came from readers. Ordinary people who said the book had changed how they thought about the ocean, made them wonder what lay beneath the surface of the world they thought they knew. Parents wrote that their children had become fascinated with marine biology after reading it. Teachers wrote that they used it in their classrooms to inspire curiosity about the natural world. And that, Aronnax decided, was enough, more than enough. If even a few people looked at the sea and felt curiosity instead of indifference, wonder instead of dismissal, if even a handful of young minds turned towards science and exploration because of his words, then his captivity had served some purpose beyond his own education. The ocean, he wrote in the book's conclusion, covers 2/3 of our planet. It is the source of all life, the regulator of climate, the highway that connects all continents, and yet we know almost nothing about it. We treat it as a resource to be exploited, a barrier to be crossed, a mystery to be feared. We do not see it as it truly is, a world as complex and diverse as the land, deserving of study and respect and wonder. Perhaps someday, he wrote, humanity will have vessels that can explore the deep ocean safely, technologies that can withstand the crushing pressure and eternal darkness. Perhaps someday we will map the ocean floor as thoroughly as we have mapped the continents, catalogue its species as carefully as we catalogue birds and insects and flowers. Perhaps someday the wonders Captain Nemo showed me will be available to all who are curious, all who are brave enough to descend. But until that day arrives, the ocean will keep its secrets. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps mystery is something the world needs, something that reminds us how small we are, how much we do not know, how vast and strange existence remains despite all our maps and measurements and confident proclamations. Late one night, years after their return, Aronnax had a dream. He was back aboard the Nautilus, standing in the great salon with its floor-to-ceiling windows looking out into the illuminated deep. Fish drifted past the glass in their eternal, graceful dance, their scales catching the light from the ship's lamps, creating small rainbows in the dark water. The organ was playing somewhere in the distance, Nemo's favorite melodies, mournful and beautiful. Captain Nemo stood beside him, silent as always, but there was peace in his expression, an acceptance that had eluded him in life. The anger was gone. The grief remained, but it had softened into something gentler, more like memory than fresh wound. "Did you survive the maelstrom?" Aronnax asked in the dream, his voice echoing softly in the vast room. Nemo smiled faintly, and his eyes, for once, held no darkness. "The ocean takes care of its own, Professor. I am where I belong. I have always been where I belong. I wish I could have helped you," Aronnax said, feeling the weight of old regrets, old failures. "I wish I could have eased your pain, found some way to bring you back to the world, to help you forgive." "You did help," Nemo replied, and his voice was gentle in a way it had never been during their time together. "You saw me not as a monster, but as a man. You understood my grief even when you could not condone my actions. You mourned what I had lost instead of judging what I became. That was help enough, Professor. It was more than enough. The world doesn't believe our story," Aronnax said. "They think I invented you. They think the Nautilus was a fiction. Does that trouble you? Sometimes. Let them disbelieve," Nemo said. "The ocean knows the truth. That is sufficient. You know the truth. That is more than sufficient. Truth does not require consensus to remain true." Aronnax woke with tears on his face, unsure whether the dream had been memory or invention or something in between, some message sent across the boundary between sleep and waking, between the living and whatever lay beyond. But the peace he felt was real. The understanding was real. The ocean, he had learned, held more than fish and plants and sunken cities and drowned civilizations. It held the dreams of those who explored it, the grief of those who fled to it, the wonder of those who loved it truly and completely. It was a mirror reflecting what we brought to it, showing us ourselves in its dark, patient depths. And it was a refuge for those who could no longer bear the world above, a place where the rules were different, and the failures that haunted us on land could be washed clean by salt and pressure and time. And somewhere beneath its surface, in trenches too deep for sunlight to penetrate, in currents that flow eternal and unseen by human eyes, perhaps the Nautilus still moves. Lights glowing in the darkness like stars in an inverted sky, her hull cutting through water with the same grace and silence, her engines humming their steady, peaceful song, carrying Captain Nemo, that brilliant, tormented soul, on an endless voyage through the ocean he loved more than life, more than redemption, more than peace. Carrying secrets that will never be told, wonders that will never be seen by human eyes again, knowledge that will remain forever locked in the deep. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Nautilus rests now on some distant ocean floor, her hull finally breached by pressure or time, her machinery silent, her lights extinguished. Perhaps Nemo rests too, buried in the coral garden he would have chosen, surrounded by the creatures he protected, claimed at last by the element he worshipped. Either way, the mystery endures. The ocean keeps its secrets, and the three men who return from the depths carry those secrets with them, unable to prove what they witnessed, unwilling to forget. Sleep now, knowing that the world is larger and stranger than we can imagine, that beneath the ordinary surface of things, marvels wait for those brave enough or desperate enough to seek them. That freedom and captivity sometimes wear each other's faces, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference, in understanding that the chains we choose are lighter than those imposed upon us. Let Professor Aronnax's journey rest in your dreams tonight. Let it remind you that the ocean covers most of our world, and we have explored less than a fraction of its depths. That in the deep places, in the cold and eternal dark, life persists in forms we cannot predict, thriving under conditions we cannot replicate, beautiful in ways we cannot measure. Let Captain Nemo's brilliance and sorrow remind you that pain and genius often walk hand in hand, that exile, whether chosen or forced, changes us in ways we cannot predict, and that the line between visionary and madman is drawn by history and circumstance, not by any objective truth. Let the Nautilus itself remind you that human ingenuity, when freed from the constraints of convention and commerce and national interest, can achieve wonders that seem impossible, can build beauty in unlikely places, can create meaning even in isolation. Tomorrow is another day, with its own mysteries, its own depths to explore, its own wonders waiting to be discovered. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that even in darkness, even at the bottom of the world where pressure would crush ordinary vessels to powder, beauty endures. The ocean remembers everything and forgives everything, and perhaps, in its vast and patient way, it offers redemption to those who seek it with honest hearts. The story ends, but the ocean continues. The waves roll on. The creatures of the deep swim their ancient patterns, unconcerned with human tales. And somewhere in the darkness, real or imagined, true or dreamed, the Nautilus glides eternal and free, 20,000 leagues under the sea, in a world we will never fully know, holding mysteries we will never fully solve. Good night, sweet dreams. May your sleep be as deep and peaceful as the quiet waters where wonders wait, patient and timeless, for those brave enough to descend.